to call to order a special meeting of the Boulder City Council on July 20th, 2017. Lynette, do you want to call the roll?
Councilmember Applebaum?
Here.
Brockett?
Here.
Burton? Here. Jones?
Here.
Morzell? Here. Shoemaker?
Here.
Weaver?
Here.
Yates?
Here.
Young? Here. We have a quorum.
Great. So we have, for all the people in the audience, we're just going to convene and then move into executive session. So don't worry, the meeting you're here for will begin shortly. We only have one item, and that is to go into executive session, but first we need to amend our agenda to give a fuller description of the executive session. So here is the motion before us, and that is to add the following language: to go into executive session regarding legal advice and negotiations regarding pending Public Utilities Commission and court proceedings pursuant to CRS Section 24-6-402-4B.
So moved.
So moved?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor of amending the agenda? Great. All those, okay, so now we need a motion to go into executive session.
So moved.
Second.
Whatever. All those in favor? All those in favor of going into executive session? Okay, it's unanimous. We will adjourn to another room to be in executive session. We expect it to take
2.5 hours.
2.5 hours, and then we'll come back in this room to adjourn. Thank you.
I'm leaving at 7:30. Are you?
I'm taking your spot. Maybe you'd like to take my spot.
like to call to order the Planning Board meeting for July 20th, 2017. We have two main items on our agenda tonight and a couple of pieces before we get to our public hearings. The first is approval of the minutes, which we don't have any. So we'll move on to number 3 on our agenda is public participation for items that are not on our public hearing agenda. And those include a public hearing regarding recommendations to City Council regarding revisions to the zoning map, and then a public hearing regarding the 2018 to 2023 capital improvement program. But if anyone would like to address us on any other issues, I'm looking at Cindy and she's shaking her head. Would anyone like to address the board on issues other than those 2 hearing items?
I have a question. I started the Stanford Court rezoning was on your agenda,
Actually, if you could use the microphone.
okay? My name is Ann Fennerty, 2805 Stanford Avenue, and I believe, talking to staff and looking at your agenda item, that the rezoning of 3485 Stanford Court was on your agenda item and therefore a public hearing item.
That's correct. So it's one of the 3 rezonings that's part of the rezoning matter, which will be our first public hearing.
Thank you for the
So,
clarification.
Absolutely. So with that, the next piece that we have to formally cover is discussion of any dispositions, call-ups, and continuations, but we don't have any of those either, which brings us to our public hearing items, the first of which is a public hearing in consideration of a recommendation to City Council to adopt a general revision of the city zoning map consistent with the land use designation changes adopted in the 2015 major update to the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan. And just as a preview of coming attractions, we'll have a short presentation by staff that will be followed by questions from the board. We won't be making any decisions or making any comments, but just trying to understand any questions that we might have. Then it will be your turn. And if you're not signed up but interested in speaking on that issue, see Cindy, and she can get you signed up. And then after everyone's had a chance to speak, it'll come back to the board for us to make a decision. Before we go there, this is a legislative matter, so it's not a quasi-judicial ones, but if anyone has any disclosures or things that they'd like to cover, now would be the time. Anyone? Brian?
I actually need to recuse myself from this one, so I will see you guys after this item.
Sounds good. We'll let you know. It's all you.
Excellent.
Welcome.
Thank you. So Jay Sugnett with the City of Boulder, Planning and Housing and Sustainability Department. Before I get started, I just wanted to make sure that everyone understands all the documents that the city has received will be entered into the official record. So tonight, I'm just going to give a very brief overview. John just read the motion, so I won't repeat it. And I will go straight to why we're doing this. So this is a follow-on from the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan update. There were 4 tracks, as you may recall, from the update. And this was the first track, the public land use request process, where property owners or citizens could request changes to land use designations as part of that process. So that's where this all started. And typically, the city will follow a comprehensive plan update with a comprehensive rezoning of those properties so that the zoning map is consistent with the comprehensive plan. So all that, there was a long process involved with that, fall of 2015, winter of 2016, initial screening. Planning board and city council went through that and determined which ones they wanted to move forward. August 8th and the 26th, staff held open houses to review the draft staff recommendation. October 13th is when planning board and city council held their public hearing. And they deliberated and made their decisions on November 17th and December 15th, respectively. And as I recall from the planning board decision, it was unanimous to change those land use designations. So So the recommendation in the hearing, there are 3 properties that are being carried forward as part of the rezoning. 2 are in Naropa campuses, one, excuse me, on the Arapahoe campus, and the other on the Nalanda campus, and the other is Mount Calvary Church on Stanford Court. So the Naropa campus, I think everyone's familiar with it. There is a portion of the property that has had a land use designation of high-density residential. This was initiated by the university for that 3.6 acres to change it to public. And the rationale for that decision last fall is consistent with the current intended uses of the university. It acknowledges Naropa as a university and community asset, and it clarifies the policy intent for future zoning implementation. So in terms of the zoning, so as John mentioned, it's not quasi-judicial. This is legislative. The comprehensive plan states that the primary, the rationale for changing zoning is consistency with the land use designation. So it's consistent with the land use designation, it's consistent with the current and future uses as a university, and it's consistent with the rest of the campus, as well as the CU campus to the south and also to the east. The other parcel is the Naropa's Nalanda campus, also initiated by Naropa. And this was changing it from community industrial to community business. And part of the discussion was this is where Naropa plans to expand their campus. They're fairly constrained at the Arapahoe campus, and the community industrial was not appropriate. So the rationale, again, was consistency with the current and intended uses, and for a lot of the same reasons, and community business is not really inappropriate in a predominantly industrial area. So the change, again, the primary test, is it consistent with the land use designation? It is consistent with the current and future uses of the, as a university, and it's compatible with the industrial and residential zoning in the area. There's quite a mix out there. The third one is 3485 Stanford Court, Mount Calvary Church. There was quite a bit of discussion about this site. Just some pictures. I think everyone's familiar with the site. It was initiated by the church for the entire site, 4.8 acres. It previously had low-density residential land use designation, and the request was for medium-density residential. So part of the rationale, there was an intent on the church's part to provide housing on the site. So part of the rationale was that there is a scarcity of housing sites in the city. It helps achieve many of the housing goals and furthers the comp plan core values related to housing and diversity. And a lot of the discussion was around the site location and the characteristics, proximity to transit services, that it was suitable for residential development. Additionally, the range of units was consistent with the land use designation to the south, and through good site design, it could be compatible with the sites to the north and to the west. And because it is such a large site, there was a lot of design flexibility to address some of the constraints on the site. So the recommendation to change the zoning, again, it's consistent with the land use designation of medium density residential. It's consistent with the zoning to the south and could be compatible with the single family neighborhoods through good site design. And it helps achieve city housing goals. So the next steps, assuming planning board approves the recommendation, council will have their first reading on September 5th, public hearing on September 19th, and it would be effective 30 days later. That's it. Any questions?
Great, thank you, Jay. Questions from planning board, Liz?
When we saw this before, and we were talking, I believe Susan Richstone was helping us understand, but because there's that steep slope that's sort of not buildable, we had talked about maybe setting up separate zones, one for the buildable portion and another one for the not buildable portion. it would be, I don't know, maybe open space other or something. I don't know what the other zoning designation would be. But did you all explore that at all after we talked about it?
No, because you approved the medium-density residential for the site.
But as a land use?
Correct.
Yeah, and I was talking about the zoning for, after the land use, if the zoning might look at the possibility of that unbuildable portion having.
Oh, applying a different zone to the steep slope. No, I think we basically are relying on our regulations, the steep slope ordinance, to address, it doesn't preclude development on steep slopes, but it basically strongly encourages it.
You mean discourages it?
Yes.
And, but all of the density that theoretically could be put there gets transferred to the buildable part of the site, is that right?
Correct. And we tried to be very clear about that as in the staff report and the presentation.
Okay. Thanks.
Crystal?
I have a question on the Stanford Court. So what is the difference in the units per acre between RM1 and RM2? And RM1, it's 6 to 14. I mean, RM2, it's 6 to 14 units per acre.
Correct. Yes, there is a range in the land use designation,
Yeah.
and then the zoning is more specific.
Yeah, and I just can't get it up on my little iPad easily, if you don't mind.
Ella has the hard
Thank
copy.
you.
Are there any other questions while
Yeah,
Ella's
well-
taking a look at that? Go ahead, Crystal.
While you're looking that up, if you look on the zoning map, which was in our packet, you see, it's this map here, and it shows, it's the zoning map that was in the packet, and I forget what page it was. It was a link. But you'll see right in the middle of the whole complex, whole low-density complex around Table Mesa, that you have an RM2, do you have a,
Is that attachment A,
I think it must be.
the zoning map?
Yeah, the zoning map.
We also have a handout.
Yeah, we have a copy here on the dais.
You're talking about the other side of Table Mesa at the shopping center?
Okay, you really have to look at the map. Do you have the handout?
Yes, I mean, I have a copy.
Okay,
It's
great.
kind of hard to see.
So if you look at that pinkish color right in the middle of the whole Table Mesa area, on the very bottom, there's an RM-1 of that pinkish area. So it's a transition from the RM2 to the RL1. And so I was just wondering, why did you choose RM2 for the zoning and not have a transition into the low density?
Well, I guess I would consider the RM2 a transition as well. I mean, it currently transitions into single-family. And the allowed number of units is comparable, and Hala is still looking up the numbers.
So RM1 and RM2 are regulated quite differently. RM1 doesn't actually have a number of dwelling units per acre limitation. It's regulated by minimum open space per dwelling unit, and it requires 3,000 square feet of open space per dwelling unit, while RM2 is limited to 12.4 dwelling units per acre and requires a certain lot area per dwelling unit, but doesn't have the same open space requirements. So it's a different way of regulating the density on a site.
Yeah, thank you. And so what the RM2 allows is 6 to 14 acres. And then I'm assuming through the site review process, one would determine where in that range would be an appropriate number for this site. Right?
Right, so the medium-density land use designation is the 6 to 14.
Right.
And the zoning gets more specific, and it's, because like Hella was saying, it's difficult to compare the two zones based on how it's calculated.
Oh, I'm sorry, is there a range in the zoning? I thought you read the range for the zoning, 6 to 14, for the zone.
I think that's for the land use map designation.
Okay, what's the units for RM2 in the zoning, on the zoning?
12.4 per acre.
Okay, 12.4. I'm sorry, I didn't hear that, Hella, when you mentioned it before. Okay.
And then in site review, I think you were starting to talk about that, and site review has a lot of different standards that are being considered, compatibility of the mass of a building, the height, and so forth, but also a cut and fill into a hillside, open space, preservation of, certain areas, so it will be reviewed in a lot of different ways
Great, thanks.
for compatibility.
How big is the whole site? How many square feet? Do you know?
Square feet,
I know it had it in here.
4.8, I want to say. Is that right? Yes, 4.8.
1,000 square feet, if you had to do square feet.
How many?
It would work out to about 200,000-ish off
Okay.
the top of my head, because it's around 5 acres and 43,000
Okay,
change square
yeah.
feet per acre.
Thank you.
Other questions from the board?
Sure. The 5 houses to the south, the zoning is staying the same, but I noticed in the land use designation that they are currently zoned LR. And so there's, on the new land use map, there's a little peninsula of LR into there, but I don't know if that, since it's not on the site, if that was ever looked at, since it seems to be inconsistent, but it was already, so.
So let me clarify, because we confuse land use and zoning a little bit.
Right.
So the zoning has always been RM2
Okay.
on those sites for at least 2 decades, I believe. So what we did as part of the land use change for the Mount Calvary Church is we changed the land use designation from low-density residential to medium.
Oh,
The
you,
zoning hasn't changed.
So
you did change it on there. Okay.
here are the minutes from the October 13th meeting, and all these addresses represent those buildings, those lots that we changed.
Okay, yeah, and I was relying on the existing map to make that conclusion. Okay, thank you.
That's fine.
Liz, did you have another
Well,
question?
just in the write-up, it talks about 29 to 67 units total, but because RM2 maximum is 12.4 units per acre, then that changes that number of what they can do, is that right?
Right.
Okay,
So I can't do 14 anymore. The maximum is 12.4.
okay. That's all.
Any other questions? So I just had 1 or 2 procedural questions. The first was if the planning board doesn't recommend the zoning change tonight, is that something that would or could come back up at some point? There's no restriction in the same way that there is for site review, is there?
No, because it's legislative, there is no critical timeline.
And then I think in the packet discussed that some of the rezonings are being held for us to consider after the enhanced community benefit provisions are kind of put in place. And just curious to just, hear why this is in that bucket rather than, or is in the current bucket rather than in that bucket.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the other properties that are not included, one, and specifically, they're outside of the city, so we're not proposing to change the zoning there because we can't. The primary ones where we would be changing the land use designation, or it was changed to something more to a higher level, those are on 33rd and Broadway. At this time, I don't think the property owners or the city were quite ready to change the zoning on those sites, primarily because we want to get that work underway to implement the community benefit that was adopted as part of the comprehensive plan update. Stanford Court is a little bit different. The fact that we have our housing authority and Fraser Meadows in a partnership to purchase the property, we will get more affordable housing as a result of that transaction than we would through any sort of enhanced community benefit for the site. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you. Any other, Harmon?
And Jay, just to clarify, because I saw 33rd and Broadway on the staff packet to us as well. Did you mean 3303 Broadway
Yes.
and Iris?
So it's not just 3303 Broadway, it's 2 or 3 other
The other
parcels
properties that are
around there as
adjacent.
well.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay, thank you.
Great. Any other questions?
Just one other on the Naropa properties. The public has a range of uses that are allowed, the public zone, like all our zones do. But is retail, restaurant, or retail restaurant type of uses allowed in public?
Looks like hell is breaking out the code. So my recollection from this whole discussion was, yes, it is limited, but keep in mind they're also limited by their annexation agreement, particularly for the Nalanda campus. So the city granted specific exemptions for more commercial and also auditorium space. And all that was documented as part of the land use change.
So they would be allowed under public to have a coffee shop, a restaurant that would be open to the public?
Right, and the idea of,
If it's in their annexation agreement, and you said it was?
well, and the public does allow more flexibility than the industrial. So that was another rationale for changing it.
Okay.
Could I ask one more question?
Sure. Go ahead, Liz.
Just to follow on your last question, is there any risk of, if we upzone the Stanford Court property, that it gets sold to a regular for-profit developer, and they put in medium-density housing, and we don't get the community benefits that we are hoping to get? What's the risk of that?
So I would say there is a risk. I don't want to tell you that there isn't. There's a risk rezoning it, and there's a risk not rezoning the property. I think Boulder Housing Partners and Fraser can tell you more specifically what those risks are, and it'll be up to you to weigh that.
Okay. Thanks.
Great. With that, why don't we go to the public? Cindy, do we have folks signed up? Terrific. So we have, looks like 7 or 8 folks signed up. Just a few ground rules here as we get started. When you come up, if you could let us know who you are and where you live, we appreciate that for the record, and to know where you're coming from. And then we care deeply about what everybody has to say, so if you could keep quiet while somebody else is speaking. If you like what they're saying, then thumbs up or wave your hands. If you don't, you can make a face or thumbs down, but we really do want to be able to hear everybody speak and have a civil discourse here. Some of you are pooling time, and I'll need to check to make sure the person that you're pooling with is here with you, and we'll double check that and move on. And then the standard time to speak will be 3 minutes. If you've pooled with one other person, which I see there's at least 1 or 2, that'll be a 5-minute period. And with that, I think we're ready to go. And Ann Fennerty will join us again on that one. And thank you. See that you're here as well. So,
Ann Fennerty, 2805 Stanford Avenue.
welcome.
Thank you. So I'm asking you to deny the rezoning of the property at 3485 Stanford Court. And I will tell you why. Presently, there are two plans. There are no definite plans, but there are two plans. One, to build 45 units on the site, and the other one is to build 57 units on the site. The option one is the church and the two large parking lots remain, occupying 3.3 acres of the site, of the 4.8 acre site. That leaves 1.5 acres for 45 units. That includes a 16% slope as well for the 1.5. The total required planning, the total required parking areas for the remaining church and the 45 units in that scene is 116 parking places. That's your regulation. Option two, the church leaves and 57 units are built. Even though this has not been decided which option Boulder Housing Partners is going to choose, they're asking you to rezone from RL1 to RM2 in order to facilitate the sale of the property between Calvary Lutheran Church and between Fraser Meadows. That sale is contingent on the rezoning of the property. The surrounding residential area where I live and most of my neighbors live is RL, excepting a few multiple apartments on Harvard Lane and 5 duplexes south of the site. I would like to talk about the 5 duplexes that this gentleman here asked about. They were built in 1954, and they were non-conforming until their land use designation was changed 57 years later. In other words, at the time that the land use designation for Stanford Court was changed, the land use designation for the duplexes was changed so that it should be a more compatible environment for the multiple housing on Stanford Court. I would also like to point out that Planning Department sent me some information about 1966, when this was a very small town, and owners of the site planned to build 3 multiple-use high-rise apartments, and at that point, Planning Board simply said, no, you're in a single-family area, and a slope with 16% you can't build. So the access, I would simply like to talk about the access to the development. It's only through Stanford Court. Stanford Court is a very short street that goes out to Stanford Avenue. And from Stanford Court, before you get to the church, this whole thing is about a quarter of a mile or less. There is also an access to 4 huge buildings of the Boulder Creek apartments. That's their only access and their only way to come out to Stanford Avenue. So these are 4 large apartment buildings. Each of them have about 6 units, and then one of them has 8 units. And their only access is through Stanford Court, which will be the only access for these 57 units, if that's what's going to be built there. And this is the only access to Stanford to Table Mesa. And Table Mesa is already Table Mesa and Stanford is already a very congested intersection. About the neighbors, some of us are here who were part of the building charrette. They really questioned why Planning Board is told that the 45 units are going to be built at 45 units are built at 4.8 acres, when they're really only built on 1.5 acres. This is called density transfer. I had not heard about it, but it's a way where you consider an entire built-up site as if it was bare land when it's owned by the same owner, and you can build on it as if you were building on a plain, empty site. Then we, at one of the meetings with the developer, Tim Johnson from Fraser Meadows Manor, we asked him why his inclusionary requirement is not building on their own site. We were told that the units that they are building are expensive and wouldn't be suitable for affordable rentals. Okay, then the other thing that we found out through one of our neighbors that Colorado, I'm almost through, Colorado Colorado CRS 3123 allows neighbors who live within 10 feet of the development to petition for relief from a rezoning, and you have got those petitions. So I would also like to say that on a planning department survey, originally in September, 23 of 25 of the neighbors who who replied opposed that. Additionally, 87 people signed in opposition. Please support our neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fenerty. Next up is Chris Moe. Welcome.
Hi, I'm Chris Moe, 2595 Stanford Avenue. I'm asking you not to rezone the Stanford property, and for that matter, to kind of stop this development stuff that's going on all over Boulder. We have 60,000 in-commuters. We have many teachers, social workers, police officers, and the like who can't afford to live here. We have long-term citizens who can't afford to live here. Yet, we are considering rezoning the Stanford property without addressing any one of these issues. Instead, this rezoning will add to our community's problems. I had the opportunity to discuss the Stanford development property with BHP staff. I was told that the units are going into Stanford weren't being built for city retirees. People from outside the city could live there. What? Yeah. So Boulder is proposing to have 20% affordable housing. But imagine what citizens of Boulder would think if they knew that these people in need of affordable housing were not our citizens. I was told they were retirees age 55. By the way, I'm 55, and I don't like to think of that as a senior, but anyway, above seniors. They are not essential services people, not nurses, teachers, social workers, police officers. Nor are they any of the 60,000 in-commuters. They are people that will add to our commuting problem. We are going to import another person here. So then we're going to have 100,000, and it sounds like 56 people. And of that 56 people, we're going to have 20% more housing. So we are considering building a huge number of homes for retirees who don't live here. They won't work in essential services programs, nor will they address reducing the 60,000 in-commuters who clog our roads. They will utilize our services, and many of the developments that this board is considering are developments that don't pay property taxes. So we're going to be burdened as citizens to pay more share for more people. Let's take our citizens' money to subsidize housing out of city folks who pay no property tax and utilize our services. Does anyone benefit from this? Why are we doing this? Because the developers want to make a ton of money. I'm against this rezoning. I'm against affordable housing for anyone who doesn't perform essential services. And I know I speak for many fellow citizens who are sick and tired of having our communities ruined by poor planning that doesn't address our city's major issues. And thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Moe.
Can I ask Chris a question?
Sure.
Chris, I mean, it might be unfair for me to ask just you this.
No, please do.
What do people around you want to see there?
Well, we've been fine the way it is. I recently moved there. I came from Gun Barrel, 24 years in Gun Barrel. But we want affordable housing that addresses our affordable housing. If we are importing people from other communities and we are asking every 4 houses to subsidize an affordable house for a 5th person, which is what happens when you have 20% affordable housing. Actually, it's more than that. And we're doing this in all the communities. I think there's like 18 or something. I'm not sure. But everybody's talking about this, and everybody's upset by it. Especially, why are we importing people who can't afford the housing, but not any of the 60,000 people who are already driving in and clogging our roads? That's a huge issue that we need to address.
Yeah, anyway. I didn't mean to interrupt, but so you'd like the density to, affordable housing,
keep it the way now.
Density to be more.
I don't want affordable housing that's not for essential services.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you.
Or for people that have long-term lived here. Okay? I don't want to import a retiree, okay, that's another driver in our community, and that everybody is subsidizing.
Oh,
Thanks, Ms. Moe.
Was that clear? I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks, Crystal.
Thank you, Ms. Moe. Next is, it's Ron Jakaitis. And I apologize if I may have missed the name here. And your pooling time is the?
My name's Ron Jakaitis, and I'm pooling time with my wife, Martha.
Fantastic. Welcome.
Thank you. We're at 2955 Stanford. We came there more than 30 years ago, raised our family, and like I think a lot of people are seeing now. It's a different Boulder that we have here than what we had 35 years ago when we first came here. And I think that's really unfortunate. The zoning of our home is low-density residential. And even with that zoning, the quality of our life is not the same as it was when we first moved here. Part of that is that large apartment complex, which is south and east of us. Every day we get out there on our lawn, Stanford Avenue is a very popular walking path. You can walk all the way up to the mountains with it. And so every morning we get out there, we pick up the cigarette butts from our lawn, the dog poop from our lawn. And the lady who was here just ahead of me, I can't think of a clear case on why the zoning on this site should not be approved. As far as the affordable housing, absolutely. If there could be a way to really justify it, and to me, the justification is not affordable housing. It's to have affordable housing for the people who provide services to the people who live in Boulder, to those people, the firemen, the policemen, the nurses, even doctors. And I'm told, nope, we can't limit it to those essential services. So if you have affordable housing, which is a free-for-all, you can bet it's going to be a free-for-all, and the people who are going to be coming in are going to be coming in from anywhere. I spent several years working up in Alaska in the Aleutian chain, and one of the communities out there received a government grant. In this case, it was for provide housing for the homeless. And they essentially turned it down because, and the rationale was because if you build it, they will come. So if we build this affordable housing, and I'm certainly not against affordable housing, but I like that, and I think it should go to those people who do provide the essential services that we need in Boulder and have the housing for those. And this came up all of a sudden, at least to us, to see that this was going to take place. And as far as the Lutheran Church, they're still there. I've heard discussions about that. There's going to be shared parking. There's no way you can have shared parking. Whenever there's a big event up at the church, we have cars parked up and down Stanford that, impact our neighborhood and the low-density residential housing that we have. So that's the remainder of my comments. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Jakaitis. Sasha Middleman, if I'm getting your pronunciation correct.
Hi.
Welcome.
I'm nervous. I'm Sasha Middleman. I live at 481 Harvard Lane, which is directly below the steep slope. I'm a school psychologist in the Boulder Valley School District, and I'm one of the few of my friends and colleagues that can afford to live in Boulder. So I'm very acutely attuned to the issue of affordable housing in our community, and I am actually completely enthusiastic about the idea of affordable housing for seniors. It's not that I'm opposed to at all. It's the density, and I think Anne expressed in detail some of the concerns about increasing the density to that level in our neighborhood. The church is really special to us as it's a gathering place in our community. Whether or not we're members of the church, we utilize that space to walk our dogs to come together when there's a fire burning in the neighborhood. That's where we come together to not in the neighborhood, but nearby when we can see the smoke. That's where we come together to meet. And during the flood, that's where everyone came together to say, how's your house? So having that space available is special to us. But I do want it to go to something good. And I think that the idea of putting that many units in that space is terribly worrisome because the intersection of Table Mesa and Broadway is already colossally congested and is very difficult to get out of in the morning on my way to work. And I'm really worried about the parking, whether or not they can support the number of vehicles that they intend to. But more than anything, as you mentioned, there's the issue of the steep slope. I live directly below it. During the flood, we worked through the night to hold it back as it was starting to collapse down on our property. The soil is soft, and I'm really worried about how they're going to build that much on that space and be able to support it safely. And I think that our property is greatly at risk in that situation. So anyway, and also I want to say that I support many of my neighbors' statements, but not every single one. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Middleman. Next up is Tim Gorley. Is Mr. Gorley here? Gormley.
There you go. I'm not too picky about that.
Appreciate it. Welcome.
Hi, I'm Tim Gormley, 3390 Dover Drive. I was actually on the part of the design group that worked together with all the stakeholders and some of the neighbors to try to implement a plan that would get affordable housing there and something that the neighbors could live with. You guys know it. I think they can put 30 units on that site as is without rezoning. There's a lot of back and forth in there. The Boulder Housing Partners and the architect were good people to work with. So what we kind of finally ended up with is a 46-unit development. It's a pretty massive development. It's kind of overwhelmed the neighborhood a bit, but they tried to keep it pushed back as far as they could. The neighbors kind of look at me to kind of know what's going on this development. And most of the neighbors I talk to would prefer that it just stays a church. They like having a church there, hearing the kids play in the recess and all that stuff. They accept that they have by rights to develop the 30 units without rezoning. They're okay with the 46 units as long as it is truly affordable senior housing for Boulder residents. Anything greater than 46 units, they're very adamantly opposed to that. And my problem with the rezoning proposal at this time is there's no guarantee on the number of units, and there's also no guarantee that it'll be affordable housing. I kind of suggested at one of these meetings that they split this lot into two sections because most of the lot is not being used for the development, and change the zoning on just the development part and leave the rest of it as whatever it is, RL1 or something like that. They didn't like that idea, which makes me think that they have perhaps plans to develop more on the later part of the lot. Even though at the time of this design group, we were told that there's only one phase and it's going to be 46 acres. At the last meeting, they said that they might have to build more units if the cost isn't cost effective. They've also said that they don't have a budget of, I found that they bought the lot, I think for $5.25 million, and somewhere I found that they have a $22 million construction budget. The average unit size is less than 800 square feet. And adding those two together, it's about $529,000 a unit, which to me doesn't seem particularly affordable, which also makes me think they're going to try to get more units on there. So either I would say have them split the lots, or I'd do a conservation easement on it, where you'll get your 46, but then the rest of it can't get built on in the future. So at this time, I'd say don't rezone it until a better plan comes up. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Gormley. Next up is Jeremy Durham. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening, members of the Planning Board. Jeremy Durham here on behalf of Boulder Housing Partners, 4800 North Broadway, Boulder, Colorado. I'm mostly here just to let you know that we're here to answer questions, and we've obviously heard some questions already, some good ones from the Planning Board that we're here and able to answer if you call on us, and some good comments and questions from the neighborhood as well that we're here to answer. We sent you an email earlier today. I hope that you had a chance to review it and read it. It provides an update on where we're at with this project and what we're requesting now. I can summarize that briefly here now. In 2005, Mount Calvary Lutheran Church applied to have the property land use changed from low density to medium density residential. We took note of that because it's part of our mission to look for sites that would be suitable for affordable housing development. And in general, medium density sites are sites that would be, in most instances, suitable for affordable housing development. So we formed a partnership with Fraser Meadows to pursue the site. And then last year, the church voted to agree to sell it to us for the purpose of building an affordable senior housing development. As I'm sure you're aware, we were originally scheduled to be before you last week on a concept plan based in large part on feedback that we'd heard from the neighbors that two primary uses might be difficult for the site, as well as sort of an opposition to concentrating development on the western portion of the site. We've temporarily paused that and pulled that from planning board so that we could evaluate whether that there's some merit to that and what makes the most sense. And so want to reiterate that that's no decision has been made on that, but we're evaluating that and considering that now very carefully. We think that there might be some tremendous benefits to being able to pause and wait until the church vacates the property, allowing us to take a more holistic approach to planning the site, allowing us to perhaps reduce the amount of parking that's required, which helps with the project financials, as well as providing, I think, a softer footprint for the neighborhood in terms of overall square footage that might be built, because perhaps some of the existing church and community space could be repurposed in a really soft and elegant way that would perhaps work really well for the neighborhood as well as for our residents and for BHP as, of course, stewards of our assets. We got a question from Commissioner Payton about whether or not there would be guarantees about permanent affordability. So I want to be really clear on a technical point here, which is that the church still owns the land. We're under contract in partnership with Fraser to acquire that contingent upon this zoning. However, I did speak with the church as well as with Fraser, and all three of those parties are willing to commit that any additional density that's created as a result of this rezoning would be permanently affordable, provided a couple of conditions can be met through the negotiation with the city attorney's office, and I can talk in more detail about what that would be.
So I'll just start with a question. How would that happen if we or city council were to vote on this before that commitment? How do we ensure that that's going to get there as opposed to some other use?
Yeah, sure. So I think that I'll defer to Hella on this in terms of how the city would want to paper this, so to speak. But we would agree that as a condition of the rezoning, and the church would agree to this as well, that any additional density that's created would be restricted for affordable. So the church's concern here, of course, is they don't want to devalue their property right now, but certainly it'll be transferred to Boulder Housing Partners and Fraser after the zoning goes through, and we would then move forward with an affordable housing project.
And I guess another question would be, what's driving the timing tonight on this as opposed to kind of considering it when we have some of that information and can have a kind of better sense of exactly what guarantees are on the table and what they look like?
Yeah, sure. So we have a contract with the church that requires us to close on this by November or else let it go. The church has, I think, been very patient so far with the process. I, of course, cannot predict what they would do if we didn't meet that deadline, but land in Boulder is very valuable. They have, I think, simpler options for disposing of it than being patient with us to do an affordable housing project in this manner. So our goal is to have zoning wrapped up by then.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Harmon?
So would you be using the base zoning that is applied to the property now at RL1, 7,000 square feet per unit, about 30 units that are available as the the current number of market rate houses that are market rate units that are available. And
Sure.
we would subtract that from whatever number, 67, for example, or 46, and come up with, in that case, 16 affordable units that you'd be required to build and 30 that could be market rate? Is that the?
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think under the existing zoning, 29 units is
29.
what would be available. So anything above 29, it's my understanding that, I know 67 has been thrown around a lot. That's, I think, what would be allowable under the land use change, but not the zoning change that has been administratively initiated by the city, which I believe would only go to 59.
Suze, you had a question?
So, just to follow up on some of the questions that the community has had, is it anticipated that you might have a gathering area or a community facility or something that the neighborhood could still use for?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that I was actually particularly moved by that public testimony as well. And I think we feel as BHP that in most of our properties, we provide that. And so we think that that's should be an exciting thing for the neighborhood to have a BHP development coming in, because an alternative might not have that. And it might just be a bunch of single-family homes spread all throughout the lot, including down the slope. And instead, we'd propose something that we think would be overall less intense use of the site, as well as provide that community gathering space, both for our residents and the neighborhood.
Okay. And then there was questions about whether these people were going to be Boulder residents or not, and how do you select your residents?
Yeah, so we're currently in the process of actually working with HUD on this, and I think that it's our intention, HUD, Housing and Urban Development, the federal agency, it's our intention to push preferences for Boulder families, Boulder seniors, seniors who have grandkids in Boulder, family members, that kind of thing, to the maximum extent allowable by law, but there are limitations to what we can do on that under the Fair Housing Act.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then is there going to be any coordination then between Fraser Meadows and Boulder Housing Partners on who gets to live there? Because I know as a Fraser Meadows project, they wanted to meet their affordable housing goal here, and since it's for seniors, is there some, I mean, people come to them, do they refer them to you and then they might get a spot, or how does that?
Yeah, so I think there would in general be coordination, because Fraser, like any other member of the community, and particularly here, of course, we're going to want to look at people that they refer to us, but that one in particular, allowing, I think, a particular funder or a particular agency in the community to have reserved spots or a particular preference, like that we know we can't do under the Fair Housing Act. And Fraser's okay with that. They haven't asked for this or anything.
Mm-hmm. Okay. The other thing is about congregate care, which, I don't know what your vision is exactly for this senior housing, but we have a congregate care density sort of bonus, and where you can get 3 units for every 1 regular unit or whatever. Is that something you anticipate pursuing at all?
I would say no. I mean, I think that already, so we already approached once and went through a process with a design advisory group, and while the site could have yielded potentially 59 units, we landed at 45 for that concept, in part because of the coexisting uses. But we felt that with the coexisting uses, that was about the appropriate number. So I really can't imagine the scenario where the church leaves and suddenly we jump to like 180. I mean, that's not going to happen. So I would say no.
So will there be the type of senior housing, it's not going to provide any sort of supportive, like assisted living or?
Yeah, so we're not proposing assisted living or congregate care in the sense that I think it's traditionally thought of, but we always want to provide the highest level of resident services as we can to our residents, and so we have a whole resident services team at Boulder Housing Partners. Fraser is also really interested in exploring this realm as part of their commitment to be a good community member in Boulder, and they're interested in piloting a suite of services at this site as well as perhaps some others that are BHP sites. And so the more services we can provide, the better. That allows seniors to age in place, which ultimately has a positive impact on our residents. It has a positive impact on the city, saves the city and the county money through the various medical and other funds that are set up for that. And so overall, the more services we can provide, the better.
Okay. Those are all my questions. Thank you.
Crystal, do you have a question?
Yeah, so I think I understand now the church wanting to retain their by right uses.
That's right.
In case you all went away.
Of course.
And they'd still have that use. So I understand that. And I think you got off on the right foot by starting the conversation with the neighborhood, and Mr. Gromley apparently was on a committee. Your report was really interesting, and thanks for sharing that with us. And then this letter, I thought it was great. Can you distribute this to neighborhoods so they kind of are up to date on what's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. So that letter is actually based on some talking points that we've already distributed to the neighborhood group and the design advisory group. But we, of course, in the spirit of full transparency, will distribute that letter to anybody that's here tonight, as well as anybody else that wants to see it.
And then the city has a public participation working group that came out with the report. And all you have to do is Google it for City of Boulder. And I would encourage everybody here to read it, because we keep having these contentious hearings, and it's all about the density and a few other issues. But I don't know if you could take a little bit of time, if we actually had a place saver for a rezoning for you, to see if you could get closer to, having more of a consensus with the neighborhood.
A consensus on
what, what might be a concept plan that would be acceptable, and what might be, even if it's medium density.
Sure.
What might be some of the conditions you'd be willing to put on the site as part of the site review application?
Yeah, so I think that here, when we talk about if we do pause the project here, which I'll say I think is probably likely, then we're probably talking about at least 5 years into the future. So before we picked that back up again, and that would depend on when the church elected to vacate. And so I do think it would probably be premature to be sketching out specifics of a project that bind either BHP or Fraser. But of course, we'll engage in the most thorough community process at that time as we possibly can.
I'll ask Hella the question when we get done, is how can we condition a zoning, besides come up with a new zoning or medium density affordable housing zone, something like that. Yeah. And I don't know how we can condition a zone.
Let's try to keep it to questions for Mr. Durham, because we've got other members of the public, and we'll come back to the discussion.
Okay.
Well, I do think one thing that's helpful on that topic is you have 3 community-oriented agencies that are willing to voluntarily agree to it. So I think that removes some of the legal legwork burden from Hella and her team, but I could be wrong about that.
And then finally, I was on the board that did the Affordable Housing Alliance work, and our first project was the Poplar community west of Broadway on Poplar. There are a series of little cottages, so to speak, and I was on the interview group interviewing prospective tenants. And our requirement was, we didn't have a requirement that you had to live here, because you were going to be living here, obviously. People did live in Boulder, but we did have a requirement to work here. Now, that would go away probably with seniors unless they had a job, and we were able to do that. So everybody was working in Boulder.
Yeah, I think similarly with our family sites, we're exploring the maximum extent to which we can push preferences for people that work here, because I think that we sit in traffic on the way to work just like everybody else, and we feel that part of the service that BHP can and should provide the city is housing our workforce and housing our seniors here, so our grandparents, our workforce, our firefighters, our teachers. That has a tremendous benefit for all of us and the environment when we do reduce those 60,000 end commuters a day. So we're looking at how we can do that to the maximum extent possible as a service to the city.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Durham. Next up, I think, is Joyce Price, who's pooling with Bob Price. Is Bob here? Or Bob, are you going and pooling with Joyce?
I left my hearing aids at home in the rush to get here.
And is Joyce here?
Pardon?
Is that you? Okay, welcome.
That's my wife.
Yes, welcome.
Yeah. I'm Bob Price, 2905 Stanford Avenue. We moved from Dover Drive in Auburn 30 years ago to Stanford Avenue to avoid people moving in and a lot of traffic through there. And I'm fine, and I have been sitting outside on my porch reading usually for the past 10 years. I'm retired from the university and former commanding officer of the Navy at CU. And I do a lot of reading outside. Lately, in the last year or so in particular, we have an excess of traffic, but it isn't just traffic, it's speeding. And the speeding bumps don't seem to alleviate any of the speeding that's going on. And there's a lot more noise. Also, the neighborhood across the street has 7 people. The house next to that is over 10 or 12. The one next door has several, and the place is getting crowded already. I don't understand how rezoning is going to help the current problems of traffic and noise that are going on. I have written a letter to the city council a few weeks ago or whenever it was, so I won't cover anything more. That's it.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Price.
Sure.
Cindy, do we have anybody else signed up? Okay. So we've got a document from Ms. Fennerty that's we're all getting right now. And then next, and I think last speaker signed up is David Medrud. Welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, board members. My name is David Medrud, and I'm here on behalf of my wife, Marla, my brother, Mark. We own the house at 3155 Stanford. We recently inherited it from my parents. My father and mother both passed away this last year. My father, Lieutenant Colonel Nelder Medrud, a veteran of 3 wars, asked before he died, as we spoke of this matter, he said, well, if I'm gone before a decision is made, let them know my opinion, and as well as my mother. She, by the way, you might be familiar with her, Mary Agnes Aya Medrud. The Boulder City Council named, I think it was July 18th last year was her day. So she had an official day named after her. I always have a hard time saying that with some humility. In any event, so we live there at 3155 Stanford, and I'd like you to know that the Medrud family's philosophical orientation is one that supports low-income housing and is certainly understandable to the kind of densities that come along with that situation. However, the rezoning, of course, I think it brings it out from a understandable and something one can support to something that is, as you've heard from others, intolerable. There's also a quality to my experience, this family's experience with this change. I believe this is an honorable thing to say full transparency, and I hear a lot of that from others, but you realize in the entire time of this process, the Medrud family has not once been contacted. in person, through written material, or otherwise. Perhaps we missed it, but I can't see how we missed it all through this time. We've been continually informed of the matter through my neighbors. The first actually I ever heard from it personally was my son came up to me and said, "There's somebody in the backyard, Dad, and they seem to be drilling." And so we both went down there, and sure enough, there was a company there doing soil sampling from our yard, and we asked them who they were, what was going on. You know, whether or not they were curt or disregarding is maybe not a matter that colors this entire issue, but it seemed like that was definitive from the get-go of our treatment by this process. So here's the objection. The intensity of rezoning it is not acceptable to us. And secondly, to encourage those involved in this full transparency to be a little more active in their claim. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Medrud.
Okay.
Is there anybody else who would like to address the planning board on these 3 rezoning matters? Seeing none, I'll close the public hearing and bring it back to the board. And maybe Jay and Hella, you could follow up on one of the last points, which is what notice was provided to neighbors, or what notice is required on a rezoning?
So the rezoning, there are not specific recommendation or requirements.
Is your mic on?
Thank you. So for rezonings, it's a legislative process, so there are not specific requirements for notice. But during the comprehensive plan update, there was significant amount of notice. So it's not required, but the city did send out a notice to all neighbors within 600 feet of the property, announcing the open house that was up on the screen earlier, as well as a newspaper ad. The main requirement is for a citywide advertisement of the land use change requests.
Great, thank you, Jay. Any other questions of staff before we get started? Liz?
Yeah, can you tell me how many units would be allowed if it were a high-density zone instead of a medium-density zone?
So that'd be 18 units times 5 acres.
Is it 18 units per acre in the RH, whatever?
What is RH?
I mean, there are 7 RH zones.
Well, I can tell you, I think the RH2
Sounds like 14 between.
is twice as many as the RL1. I mean, I just remember that number from 1440 Pine. You could have 2 units per 7,000 square feet.
So 90 units.
90? Okay. That was my question.
Good, so why don't we start our deliberation, and what I would suggest is let's start, we haven't had as much discussion about the 2 Naropa properties, and ask if anybody disagrees with the recommendation from staff to rezone those 2 Naropa properties, and then we'll turn to Stanford once we resolve those. So anyone like to speak to the Naropa properties? Okay, so seeing none, why don't we turn then to the Stanford, where I suspect we'll have more discussion because we've had more input. And I think my recommendation is, why don't we go down the line and just at least provide an initial sense quickly in a couple minutes where people are. We'll take that temperature, and then we'll figure out what makes sense in terms of further discussion, motions, or how to move ahead. Crystal, why don't we start with you?
Okay, let me just look at my notes here, but maybe you want to start with someone else.
You want me to start with David?
Yeah, or someone else.
I can start. I came into this meeting, thinking about, the concepts that I've seen for this property, and pretty much thinking that this would be a good direction to go. But now I am more concerned when I realize that there's uncertainty. And I don't know if we can rezone with conditions. It doesn't sound like that's really done. So given that, I do have concerns that we rezone and then something doesn't go the way we really intended. The whole purpose of this whole exercise seemed to be to get us to the point where we could have a really good affordable housing solution for folks that hopefully would not impact the neighborhood too heavily. But the uncertainty that, in fact, it could change dramatically does give me pause. So that's where I'm at right now, and I'd like to hear what other folks who have been here for more history on this might have to say, since I've not seen this property before.
Harmon?
So we discussed a lot of the issues that we're hearing tonight when we talked about the land use designation change that Planning Board voted for back in October. At that time, Brian was recused as he is today, and the Planning Board voted 6-0 to approve the land use redesignation to medium-density residential. And we were concerned about guaranteeing affordable housing and senior housing at the time. We probably talked a little more on that evening about traffic impacts than we have at this meeting. And I think there wasn't a consensus, but one of the points that was brought up was that the traffic impacts of 40 or 60 senior affordable units are probably less than the traffic impacts of 30 single-family houses. And so I just wanted to focus the discussion from my perspective on the criteria for rezoning. And I think that staff is correct in that the application meets the criteria for rezoning. There's clear and convincing evidence that the proposed rezoning is necessary to come into compliance with the Boulder Valley Comp Plan. There are other criteria for rezoning, like the existing zoning was of a clerical error, that don't apply.
If I may interrupt, this zoning is actually not based on an application. This is something where the staff is asking the planning board to initiate the rezoning, and it would be a general rezoning of the city, a readoption of the entire zoning map. So the standards are slightly different.
Okay.
So if you read through the rezoning section, it states that the rezoning has to be consistent with the policies and goals of the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan. And if not incidental to a general rezoning, then you go to that list of 6 different standards that one of them would have to be met. And you started to talk about those, so those don't apply here because it's a legislative act.
So, Hella, where's the general rezoning in the code?
It's actually in the same section, I think 9-19, but let me double check. But when you read through it, there are some things that are addressed differently depending on whether it's a comprehensive rezoning or otherwise.
Okay, so I see it's an E.
Yes.
Yeah, got it.
It's also summarized in your staff report.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Are you done?
Any other comments?
No, I think I'll just hold off for now.
Liz?
Yeah, so Hella, could you address the issue of whether we can condition the rezoning to?
Or recommend to council, since
Right.
I think we can't
Yeah,
condition.
right.
Yeah, and so we don't have that concept in our code right now. When the zoning is changed of a parcel, it's designated on the zoning map as a zone, and there are no conditions associated with that. And then that zone determines a whole host of standards that apply based on that zoning district. So as far as I know, we've never done a conditional rezoning. I haven't had time to think about it very much other than just now for 5 minutes in this hearing. It seems to me, it sounds a little bit like creating a new zoning district as Crystal was suggesting, is kind of what's being proposed, or adding, it almost seems a little bit like a special ordinance. I don't know that I would recommend going down that route because it just seems inconsistent with how our zoning code works.
Do you have any sense of what the schedule is for getting the community benefits portion of a rezoning implemented? I mean, we have to, I can imagine it was many months, probably.
Yes, many months. So the staff has been discussing what to bring forward to City Council and Planning Board. That would likely happen in August. But the work plan that we would propose likely would not be adopted until July of 2018, which is when the height ordinance expires.
Okay. All right. As far as comments go, well, that is a kind of a scary prospect, and I'm sure that the neighbors wouldn't want that, because that would mean, I mean, wouldn't want it to just go to strictly market, medium density market, because that would be definitely more traffic and higher impacts than senior housing would be. So I have that issue, but otherwise, I actually think it's a good place for senior housing. It doesn't have any flood issues. And I mean, you hear these nightmare stories. We've been hearing them for months about Fraser Meadows and the flooding, and here we have this site that is probably pretty safe for a vulnerable population. And as far as senior housing goes, I think that that's one of the demographics that actually, where it makes sense to have a clustered development, concentrated development, instead of some of the other, like family housing or whatever, where it might work better to be dispersed through the neighborhoods. So I am actually thinking that I support the rezoning, but I am nervous about the prospect that it might end up just being sold as a medium density parcel and developed with, high-end housing. So those are my. Oh, and another thing is that I know a lot of people who live at Fraser Meadows, and there are people who have lived in Boulder for a long time and contributed to Boulder. And, a lot of former Planned Boulder members and people like that, former legislators, lots of people. And they, they want to stay in Boulder when they age. And I think providing senior housing for folks like that is a really good idea. And so I'm not too concerned about having a high percentage of non-Boulderites at this facility if it goes in, so. That's it.
So I'll go next, and I agree with you, Liz. I do think there's a critical need for this. I'm a South Boulder resident, and I've seen many of my senior neighbors move to Lafayette and Longmont and other places because there's no available senior housing, and certainly almost no affordable senior housing in Boulder. And it is a need, and I think this is a good use. In addition to the flood issues, it has close proximity to public transportation, to the library, and to King Soopers. And so I think it's an ideal use on that. The trick for us, of course, is, once again, we're in an awkward place where we have circumstances outside of our room here that are driving timing and are very awkward. And so I think we do have to make a risk call here tonight, balancing between the uncertainty, because we can't control, at least based on this, exactly who will go in there, versus I think the real risk that if this plays out too long and the condition isn't met by November, the sale could fall through and it could be sold to a market rate developer who, whether we rezone it or not, I agree with Harmon. The worst thing that could go in here, I think, are just regular low-density homes right now, which will drive the most traffic, will waste the opportunity of this as a senior housing spot. and will be, I think, exactly what would be worst for the neighborhood in the long run. This is a place close to one of the regional centers that deserves a little bit of density. It doesn't deserve a lot of density, but I think the range is appropriate. So I think based on the balance of risks, we are much better off putting it in the hands of BHP, which has a relationship with the city, and I think we have more sway over than a purely private transaction for somebody that maybe will have the tools of site review, but we have criteria, and we can't say no to any development that meets those criteria. So I will be in favor of the rezoning tonight for those reasons. I think it's the best way to meet our comprehensive plan goals. And if we really do mean it about affordable housing and housing in Boulder, this is how we get it. If we don't mean it, we have to turn it down. But I think we do. So, Crystal?
Yeah, I think a number of planning board members have spoken to the quandary here, and that's why of making sure that we have some kind of guarantee to the community that it will be affordable housing for seniors, for starters. And I think that there's good partnerships, and I like how things have progressed since the first couple of concerns at the beginning that I had. But I think I would prefer to just take another month. So Boulder Housing Partners and our attorneys in the neighborhood might be able to have some conversations and come up with that solution, even if it is another zone, and it ties some of these goals here to the site. I want to just say one thing about, Harmon started off by reminding us of the process that we went through. And I was one of the 6 votes that voted for this. And at that hearing, I said the units are going to be between 29 and 67, or 6 to 14 per acre. And I literally said these words: I don't expect it to be on the high side. And then later on, some members of the neighborhood emailed us and said, did you know that the church is going to stay, and so the units are going to be clustered on one side of the property, which made it kind of really out of character with that neighborhood. And I brought it back to the board and said, this is some new information. Would you be willing to reconsider the vote? And the planning board said no, the vote on the land use designation. So here we are, and I think Boulder Housing Partners has moved on some of their issues, wanting to pause the project for 5 years to kind of to come up with something good and maybe some different financing. But I still don't feel there's enough of a guarantee to rezone it medium at this time. And I'd like to have some good thinking go into it. And I totally appreciated your letter, Jeremy. I think that was really helpful, but I'm not ready to rezone it to medium right now I'm not talking about a 5-year pause where you lose the contract. I'm just talking about a month or so to see what might be able to be developed that would give the neighborhood some confidence of going ahead, working with you, and some guarantee that if somehow you default on the contract, or you decide not to go ahead with the contract, that there's some guarantee that the medium would still have a community benefit for the public and might not be at that higher end. So that's where I am.
Great. Thank you, Crystal. Harmon?
So, this is not the first and won't be the last time that I disagree with staff's statutory interpretation. But looking at the criteria for rezoning, It's written, therefore, City Council shall grant a rezoning application only if the proposed rezoning is consistent with the policies and goals of the Boulder Valley Comp Plan, and for an application not incidental to a general revision of the zoning map meets one of the following criteria. And then it lists 6 criteria. So, that can be read in a number of different ways. You could read it as to say that City Council would grant rezoning if the application meets the comp plan and one of those 6 criterias. It would be pretty easy criteria. It would be pretty easy to read it that way. I think if you wanted to make it clear that this is the way staff's going to interpret this paragraph, you should say that for general revisions of the zoning map, the rezoning has to only meet the goals and policies of the comp plan. For all other applicant-initiated rezonings, they have to meet only those 6 criteria, but that's not how it's written. But that does bring us to, I think, an important point, which is that in order to have an applicant requested rezoning approved, all it has to do is meet one of those 6 criteria. And so if we at Planning Board decide not to go forward with this rezoning that meets the land use designation change that we made back in October, then we can just put the onus back on the applicant and say, pay all the fees for rezoning, come back in with an application for rezoning, and make the first criterion the entirety of your application, that by clear and convincing evidence, this rezoning meets the underlying land use map designation. And then I would find it very hard as a planning board member to deny that application when the code is so clear that you only need to meet one of those 6 criteria, and that first criterion is certainly met. So I don't see any benefit when we're trying to promote affordable housing to force an applicant that's ready to provide us affordable housing to go through an applicant-driven rezoning application process, pay all those fees, and waste all that time to get the exact same result that I'm prepared to give them tonight.
Any other follow-up discussion or motion? Liz? And then David.
Well, when is council supposed to see this?
September 5th and September 19th.
5th and 19th, so it's like first reading, second reading kind of thing?
Right. The first reading is the 5th, and the second reading, public hearing, is the 19th.
So maybe we could make a recommendation to council if we recommend the rezoning that, or maybe the recommendation goes to, actually to Boulder Housing Partners and the Fraser Meadows to bring some kind of agreement to council that sort of covers this sort of risk issue that we're concerned about.
So just to be clear, you would recommend acting tonight, but with some further language onto a motion here that would say something like City Council and the applicant would explore, ways of ensuring affordability for any increased density, something like that?
Something like that. Right.
And then council will have all of that information to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
Thoughts about that? David?
What would that look like? What kind of?
Well, I'm seeing Jeremy's got like gestures. So do you want to come up and talk? Do you have ideas about how that might, you can, he can. Sorry, you're the chair, so.
Yeah, please come join us.
Again, Jeremy Durham, Boulder Housing Partners. I think that we would certainly work hard with the staff between now and the City Council hearing on this topic to try to figure out a way to provide assurances contractually within the limits of the Boulder Revised Code. And we have a lot of creative people, so I'm confident we could come up with something. Perhaps at a minimum, we ask the church even now while holding the property to provide some kind of a covenant or perhaps an agreement from BHP and Fraser to the city of Boulder that if and when we take title to the property, we'll build it as affordable within these ways. We're open to all of those things because for us, it's so hard to get our hands on a piece of property that we can really do this with. And so we run into these difficult situations where process doesn't always line up with our goals and our policy, and that's where we have bright, committed people like the city attorney's office and the housing division working with our team to make it happen, and we would do that between now and then.
David?
Such a covenant would would give us a lot of reassurance if things went forward, but if the sale for some reason just didn't happen, we'd still be kind of vulnerable.
So the church, who's the property owner now, is also on board with this approach because I anticipated this question tonight. So I spoke with them, and they don't want to see their use by right now decreased, but they're willing to sign agreements and to agree that anything above that be affordable. So we could possibly set this up that your issue is addressed. I would expect that we could.
Okay.
And also for just point of clarity, we have a contract that not only has a contingency for a zoning approval, but we're required, Fraser really is the contract holder and we're in partnership with them, but they're required to close if the zoning is approved. So this will come into our hands for development of affordable housing.
Great, thank you, Mr. Durham.
Yeah.
Crystal, do you have a question for him?
One other question. When Mr. Gormley spoke, he talked about somewhere between, excuse me, somewhere between 30 units and 46 units. So how does the community, I mean, I guess the site review, we can regulate the number of units. We can approve, we don't have to approve the high end. Ella?
I think the site review doesn't go so much into the actual number of units, but you look at compatibility of the building design, the massing. Can the site hold the number of parking spots that is going to be needed, and the traffic and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so it's a good point and a good reminder that there's still, after zoning, another layer here, which is site review, which is where like the meat really gets handled. So there's that. And the other thing I can say is that, so certainly the reason that we've looked at pausing here is for the goal of trying to find an overall less intense use of the site. And I think that oftentimes when we talk about intensity, that gets sort of narrowed to just one word, density. But it's a lot more than that, right? I mean, so it is number of cars, and so we are proposing senior affordable here. It is also total building square footage. So right now there's a really large church structure that if we're move forward in a way that we cohabitate with them, I think would ultimately result in a more intense use of the site. So we're being very sensitive to those concerns and trying to meet our goals and the goals of our residents in the city and the least intense impact to the site possible.
You mean cohabitate with them in the long run?
So the church will not be there in the long run. So it's potentially a game where we'll work with the city with the church to figure out what that timeline looks like, and if that's the direction we move forward, we would look hard at that.
And during this pause, you'd continue to work with the neighborhood?
Yes, we actually met with the design advisor group yesterday to go over some of these new thoughts. So.
Actually, we need to keep the conversation
Could I ask?
here in the front there, but sure.
So I'm wondering if there's any possibility or risk that we're going to get into one of those situations like we've seen recently where the low-income tax credit, the Boulder Housing Partners or whoever the developer locks in the certain number of units and the financing, and then we see it, and it's not flexible anymore. So.
No, that's a great question. That's obviously a really hot topic here lately, and we are interested in continuing our conversations, which we've already started with city staff and other developers to try to smooth out that issue, because there is, I think, a natural juxtaposition there between those two programs. Here, I will say that we don't think this is a good site for a 9% tax credit allocation, which is primarily where you see that, which would allow us a lot of flexibility to move forward with neighborhood process and concept plan in advance of a tax credit award. And in fact, here, you'll see we've already done that once, right? So we already put together a package, worked with the neighborhood, spent our funds exploring this well in advance of the tax credit application period. And what we would have applied for here if we were to move forward would be February. So we've already engaged in a lot of that and would have brought the concept plan last week well in advance of that tax credit process.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Durham. David.
I'll just add a comment on the traffic impacts. I understand how neighbors are always very concerned about traffic impacts. I do, having walked the site and looked, and I do have to say Stanford Avenue is stunning. You know, that view is just amazing. I had never really taken notice of that. But I do feel that there is a pretty direct line to the Table Mesa Drive. I think that there's ways to kind of try to make sure that there isn't too much traffic spillover along the avenue going the other direction. So, and I do feel that this, what we are hoping for to work out will actually be something that would not have traffic impacts at the times where it's really demanding on that intersection. So, so I think that, you know, I'm very favorable to this, the future of that property from that standpoint compared to many of the other alternatives, honestly, without even changing zoning. So to me, you know, there's a couple of ways to look at that. So I wanted to point that out.
Crystal,
Just one other question is, so the contracts between Fraser and the church, is there any opportunity to get the contract date pushed a little bit farther? Beyond November?
I can't guarantee that the church would do that. And like I said, I think that the church has been pretty patient to this point, is my feeling, because we originally approached them about this. It's been a while now, I think over a year and a half. And so, and this is just, the process takes a while. But I do think that, I mean, with the land value where it is, they could probably sell this for low-density residential in excess of what they're selling to us for. So I think there would be a risk of that. And I can't speak for the church, I can't promise.
Thank you, Mr. Durham. So why don't we bring it back to the board, and I think just to keep us moving, because we also have another matter with a lot of people waiting on this, I'm going to make a motion that the planning board initiate a general revision to the city zoning map and recommend to City Council adoption of a general revision of the city zoning map consistent with the land use designation changes adopted in the 2015 major update to the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan as shown in Attachment A. However, considering the availability of measures to ensure affordability of any increased density available at 3485 Stanford Court.
I'll second.
Okay,
So
I
I've
didn't
made a
get
motion.
that. Yeah, could you just tell me, could you just read that last sentence regarding Stanford Court?
And I made that up on the fly, so
Oh, that was
if you
good.
have that. Okay,
You
so
said,
the notion of that was the recommended motion, and then conditioned on City Council considering the availability of measures to ensure that any increment of additional density at 3485 Stanford Court would be affordable. I think the original motion, probably the wording will count, but that was the intent. David?
Yeah, I'm in favor of that kind of additional language. And is there a way we could even kind of say through the covenant process or something like that? Or is that appropriate? Or would it just be enough to?
Personally, I'd rather leave it open for the creativity of staff, the applicant, neighborhood, the church to look for those. I do think a covenant or easement or others is probably the leading candidate, but I think let's leave it as broad as possible. If maybe there's a better way, maybe Hella will come up a way to think about some conditional uses or a different zone or something else like that. But it'll give at least 6 to 8 weeks for people to think creatively about it.
and
Other discussion, Crystal?
I was just going to say, the other issue is the number of uses. And, you know, as Jeremy said, there issue, I mean, you could address the intensity by the size. It's even in our code, if you had something in the code that could address the size of the units. But that is troubling for me because on all of these, we go right to the high side immediately without considering the some of our site review criteria. Well, we do when we get to a site, when we get to the site review, but without considering the compatibility with the neighborhood and the different characters of neighborhoods. So that's where we always seem to get stuck. And even though people say, I'd like this in my neighborhood, it seems like a good fit, can you reduce the units somewhat? And do you think that this zone will allow, that we're recommending, will allow that to happen? I mean, theoretically, yeah, because we have that whole list of site review criteria.
And I'll just say as a mover, and just to help explain to the public, any, I think, development on here that would be over a relatively small number of units, but anything BHP is talking about will have to go through the site planning process, and we'll have to apply those criteria. And some of those criteria do get to the size. I personally think that the full range is appropriate in this case, and that given the proximity to transit, given the transportation and the particular use for senior affordable housing, that would be appropriate, but we'd actually have to see a proposal and judge it against the site review criteria at that point. I do think if you made it not affordable, if you made it more like single housing, I think it'd actually have a harder time meeting it because of the traffic generation, but others may have different thoughts on that. Liz?
Yeah, so we still haven't even seen a concept plan, I don't think, have we? No. So there were a couple layers of review still before anything happens there. But I hope that when it does come back for concept plan, that the development has something for the neighbors. So that, because so many of the projects, it seems like it's really kind of just a loser for the neighbors, and they just have to accommodate. So I hope this one comes back with something for the neighbors.
Other comments, David?
Just on that line, I mean, I did go, that we were given a draft concept plan, and I did notice, things like that, a new path diagonaling down through the slope that would connect to an existing path down there, which would provide some neighborhood walkability and a nice, pedestrian use path that doesn't exist. So I noticed that one on the draft. So I would expect, hopefully, to see that in the upcoming concept.
And it's not an easy site. I know we're getting into a site review, concept review discussion, but it's not an easy site with one entry in, one entry out. I mean, it's a gorgeous site, and I'd love to have affordable senior housing at that site. I think it's perfect rather than disjointed from the community by putting it on the edges like we've done in some cases. But I'm probably not going to vote for this. I mean, I want to vote for 1 and 2, and I could make sure that shows up in the minutes, and I favor the zoning, I recommend the zoning change for 1 and 2. But I don't think we've explored enough on what a medium zone could look like in this area and address some of the affordability issues and some of the compatibility with the neighborhood for that site. Because remember, we're taking 4.8 acres and putting it all in one area. So to me, there should be some kind of mitigating factors. Now, maybe when we come up with our community benefit, it would still apply to a site review. We could still have them apply to a site review. We lose the opportunity to have them apply to a rezoning. But of course, in this case, one of probably the main community benefits for a rezoning would have to do with permanently affordable housing.
Right.
Any other discussion? With that, I'll call the question on the motion made by Putnam, seconded by Payton. All in favor of that motion, raise your hand and say aye. Aye. All opposed?
No. And
Board Member Gray?
could you have the minutes show that Board Member Gray supported the two Naropa projects and then had concerns about the zoning choices for medium.
Great, so that motion passes 4-1 with Member Gray opposed. And with that, I think that closes up agenda item 5A. And I'm going to suggest we take a few-minute break before 5B, just to get everybody set up. Jay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you very much to the public for joining us. And this process is not done because we will see proposals specifically on a project, and I do hope that the public will remain engaged on that. So thank you.
So you charge it?
You charge it here, yeah.
That's cool.
Actually,
You know what? I don't think my.
paper note taking, I just file it away. So it's, I like it. What's that?
Remember, you have to turn off your mic.
It's going to work. Of course. I am taking off unless you guys have a problem with that.
Oh, I got it.
annual review of the CIP before, but we'll spell out a few things for Peter's benefit on the planning board's role. So first out, I want to do a big shout out to all the staff that have helped with this. Phil would have been here tonight doing the presentation, but unfortunately he had a family emergency, so let's keep his family in our thoughts. But I know he wanted to be here because we've all worked so hard, and we've got a really great capital budget, a proposed capital budget this year to achieve a lot of really great things for this community. So with that, and I also want to recognize Chris Ranglis, our intern, who's this is his second CIP with us and has done just an amazing job of helping to shepherd this along and herd a lot of cats and a lot of moving pieces, and helped organize the tour on Monday. So we had a really fun time. I hope those of you that were able to go,
Yeah, it was great.
Enjoyed the
Really
tour.
Interesting.
It's fantastic.
Yeah. So with that, I'm going to start. We typically do a video that introduces and describes our proposed capital budget for the next year. We'll use this for this board, also for council, but again, for the community, because it tells the story about our CIP. So I'm going to figure out how to start it. Okay. Where's my mouth? There I am.
The City of Boulder has an extensive inventory of assets and facilities, including highly used public spaces such as streets, libraries, recreation centers, pools, parks, and public areas like the Pearl Street Mall, or our open space and mountain parks. Our essential assets include fire and police stations, water and stormwater systems, as well as those that most people don't see or use very frequently, such as city offices or maintenance buildings. Each year, the city revisits its Capital Improvement Program, or CIP, to plan for the city's future capital investments over the next 6 years. Guided by the community's sustainability framework, the CIP lays out a plan for maintaining, enhancing, and at times, expanding the city's capital infrastructure. The sustainability framework identifies 7 overarching themes, which are the basis for city plans, like the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan and department master plans. The CIP is when a community vision becomes a reality. Boulder continues to be committed to the ongoing maintenance and repair of capital assets, recognizing the critical value of civic infrastructure to the economic, aesthetic, and functional viability of the city. In fact, over 3/4 of our CIP funding over the next year will be for maintenance and enhancements to existing assets. This approach of taking care of what we have saves the city money over time, as well as ensures the quality services the community expects. Community members will enjoy the benefits of a number of important projects that will be completed in 2017. These include the construction of significant improvements at Wonderland Creek, which will decrease risks to almost 600 homes, which are located in the 100-year floodplain. 3 new underpasses to provide safe passage for pedestrians and cyclists. The completion of the new Civic Area Park, which used voter-approved community culture and safety tax funding. The now completed Baseline Underpass, the city's 80th underpass, which is connecting a busy shopping center, nearby neighborhoods, and CU in a safe and easy connection, as well as the reconstruction of the Diagonal Highway, which replaced the existing roadway and constructed new medians, bicycle lanes, multi-use paths, sidewalks, and other amenities. The 2018 CIP, with proposed funding at just over $120 million, includes a range of capital investments, including facility enhancements throughout the city and maintenance and rehabilitation of existing infrastructure. Several high-priority safety, recreation, and mobility improvements include the Scott Carpenter Aquatics replacement and enhancement, which will replace and expand the aging pool and bathhouse to provide leisure amenities to serve all ages and abilities, as well as general park improvements. The 4-mile flood mitigation and multi-use underpass, which will provide flood mitigation in conjunction with multi-use path connections from 19th Street to Violet Crossing, providing safer access to Crestview Elementary School, recreational opportunities, and replacement of structurally deficient bridges. The Broadway reconstruction will provide reconstruction of Broadway from Violet Avenue to US 36 and will include bicycle and pedestrian and transit improvements. 2 new underpasses, 30th and Colorado, which will join the University of Colorado's main and east campuses with the neighborhoods in the area, providing a safe, new, grade-separated crossing and direct access to transit stops. And Foothills in Colorado, which will replace an existing bicycle pedestrian overpass bridge that is deteriorating and does not meet ADA design. Once completed, the new underpass will better connect East Boulder with CU and the parks, businesses, academic, and residential areas on either side of Foothill Parkway. And finally, the Carter Lake Pipeline, which will provide reliable and safe water from Carter Lake to the 63rd Street Treatment Facility. In 2014, voters supported a 0.3% sales tax for community culture and safety capital investment. Boulder will be able to fund essential safety projects and enhancements for recreation and mobility projects, commission new public arts, and also provide funding for several community-based nonprofits. This has been just a small sampling of the full list of capital investment planned in the city of Boulder. For that full list and description of the proposed capital projects over the next 6 years, please see the 2018 to 2023 Draft Capital Improvements Program. As always, Boulder will continue to invest in our capital infrastructure in order to ensure our community is a sustainable and resilient city.
Terrific. Thank you, Gene. I think we may need to
You need to do a quick switch.
short break
Yeah.
so that we can make room for City Council to break out of their executive session. We'll reconvene as soon as City Council's done. Welcome, City Council.
No, I trust you with my laptop.
Okay, people are worried about you.
I'm ready.
Hi, David. I'm new tonight.
I was afraid to leave my
Well, I sent you an email. Oh, I've been trying. Okay. So this is their stuff?
Yes. Yeah, don't touch anything.
Don't take their stuff.
They told us
That.
that we had sticky fingers. Where's Tom?
Sam.
This is Matt.
Did you see Tom?
We'll do it.
You're gonna speak.
Yes. Yes, I think Sam's going to join me. I don't have a reflection that you call. It's weird. I'm wondering if
Okay, we're reconvening, having just came out of the executive session in the other room. Tom?
So I just want to ask council, the purpose for the executive session was to discuss legal advice and negotiation strategy with respect to the pending PUC proceedings and other litigation. Did anybody hear anything in the session that was outside the scope?
Nope.
No. Thank you very much.
Okay, with that, we're going to adjourn and let planning board come back in. Thank you.
Thank you.
And the electronics just did not syncing.
Thanks, Cindy.
Yeah, something didn't work because I called twice. I got your voicemail after 2 ring. Yeah, sure. Your office would be perfect.
You're fine.
I'm going to have a quick meeting here. I'll drive. So if you want to wait 10 minutes or so, or...
Hey, Jan,
I'm sure you don't want to do this.
I can handle it.
There's no sticky notes.
The interruption. Jean, you were mid-thought there, so.
No, that was perfect timing. This video took care of most of the introduction needed and spelled out a lot of the key things and a little bit of the highlights. We're going to just talk a little bit about the planning board's role, point to a few things in the CIP document, talk about the community and environmental assessment process projects, and then a little bit about the community culture and safety tax and potential capital tax renewal, and then let you guys ask us some questions. So with that, as the video said, CIP definition, it's really about major projects that are our infrastructure, our facilities, the city's investment. The capital budget really is, I mean, just as the operating budget, it's our statement of community values. I mean, it's where we put our money, and needs to be reflective of our plans. And to that point, way back in the 50s, our city charter gained I don't know how, there was citizens or exactly who, but put a clause in there that the planning department has a role in putting forth, proposing the capital budget. And the reason for that really is around back to our community values and the physical form of our community, tying it back to our comprehensive plan and our physical boundaries, and back to to the comprehensive plan that you just adopted, and the service delivery, the service standards that are set forth within that. So, well, I guess I should move ahead and talk about the plan. I'll talk about this with the planning board's role, but it's a big, wide amount of things to be looking at, but it really does tie back to a lot of the key things that this board is responsible in helping us move along. So I'm gonna move ahead on this one because the video explained our relationship to the sustainability framework pretty closely. The wide range of capital projects that we see in each CIP. I'd like to talk a little bit about the process and timeline. And so this speaks a little to, I think sometimes with the planning board members, it's hard for you guys to say, oh my gosh, how can I review this whole massive thing? And the reality is that the planning for the CIP starts way back on much further to the left of this timeline. And you guys see it in the master plan reviews, you see it in the comp plan updates, you see it in the area plans, you see it in the sub-community plans. So we're going to have a number of departmental master plan updates that are coming forward in the next couple of years. So there's going to be a lot of really interesting work, and you'll be able to see what will be forthcoming in many future CIPs through those planning efforts. I will like to highlight we have as the dots that say PRT review. That's the peer review team. I think actually all the folks that are in this room either are on the PRT or have served on the PRT. That's where our staff members really, they take off their department hat and they put on their citywide hat, and we take a look at this whole proposal over quite a few hours, going through each department's submissions to really look through this and make sure that we're meeting the values of the community and collaborating where we need to collaborate and talking about process and
and making sure that our priorities are what we want them to be. And also the other advisory boards take a look at those CIPs and they recommend them, and our staff works closely with them. So with that, your role is kind of that final stop to make sure we've done all these things. We don't expect you to have a critique of all these little things. We expect you to just be that final check to make sure that we're doing all the things that are required to make sure that we're putting our money and our capital investment in the places where our community members want us to do that. So back to the comprehensive plan, the scope, priorities, and scheduling, it's a pretty broad thing, but I'm assuring you that we do a pretty good job of trying to look at all of that along the way. We've got a couple of policy issues that arise each year, and we'll take a look at those. And then the projects that require a community environmental assessment process or some other process. We talk about process a lot with these. This year in the CIP, we handled the highlight section a little differently and made it more colorful and tried to tie back to the sustainability framework. We're really hoping that this section was kind of geared to the stuff that this board really has purview over, and hope that was helpful for you. And then in the special highlights section on the Central Boulder long-term planning, some big initiatives that are underway that will be informing, that are part of this year's CIP and will be informing future CIPs for quite a few years, but some really important projects to shape this community and to really provide a lot more of the livability aspects of those special places. So with that, I wanted to just say a little bit about the community environmental assessment process. This ties back to our city plans and projects handbook that is adopted by code that spells out our whole process for master planning and capital improvement planning and assessment of projects and process. We're going to be doing an update to that this year, and the SEEP checklist and SEEP process is one of the things we're going to be taking a look at. It's about 10 years old, so it's time to refresh and take a look at other national standards and other things, and be able to work with our teams that do this work to find the places where there are efficiencies, but also what's really needed, adding a lot of the new concepts around resilience and any other emerging topics to make sure that we're really doing the alternatives analysis and mitigation in the best way that we can. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Katie. I will say we miss Peggy. She's off to Switzerland with her family, has moved there, and so always best wishes to Peggy, but we're welcoming Katie Doling as the Executive Budget Officer.
Good evening, members of Planning Board. Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here for my first capital improvement plan. Just as background, I worked in the Parks and Recreation Department for the past 4 years, so know a little bit about the city, but really excited to learn a more holistic approach, especially as we go into budget season. So with that, the next few slides, I'm going to take time to paint the picture financially of what we're talking about for 2018 to 2023 capital improvement program. As you can see, utilities continues to comprise the majority of the funding for your capital improvement program year after year. And no surprise, you saw this last year, this big spike in 2018 related to the utilities projects. And what really comprises that is a Carter Lake pipeline, which was about $32 million, and a water or wastewater sewer interceptor, which is about $10 million. So when you looked at last year's CIP, you saw about $61 million in investments, and this year it's almost double, primarily related to those two projects, but we have a few more projects that I'd love to highlight for 2018 in other departments. In green, you'll see that transportation's included. There are several underpasses that you saw through the video, underpasses that are going to be started and completed throughout 18, including the Broadway reconstruction, 30th and Colorado underpass, and Foothills and Colorado underpass. In addition, Parks and Rec is in the light blue color, and one of the major projects that they have coming up in 2018 is the Scott Carpenter aquatic facility replacement. I do want to mention one of the things that we saw and what Jean will highlight when she goes over the capital improvement renewal proposals is that committee really highlighted something that we've known all along but haven't really addressed, and it's the need for a capital program for the departments that don't have dedicated funding sources. So a lot of what you see right now in the capital program are all because of dedicated funding. And there isn't really a capital program for our major departments like fire and police. And this is something that we really started to take a hard look at as we were developing the 18 budget, and something that I really anticipate coming back to the planning board next year with a more robust plan of how do you also have a capital improvement program for our IT systems and our large legacy system replacements. So just as a heads up, it's something that we've been working on and think that it'll satisfy a lot of the comments that came out of the capital renewal program. Also, in all cases, we try to leverage other funding sources, and this may include grants, federal grants for the airport, TIP funding for transportation, or flood and hazard mitigation for programs like utilities or open space. We have this lovely pictorial that is a little bit different than what we showed last year, which was just another line graph, but I think this really emphasizes how we're really focused and continue to be focused throughout the years on our capital maintenance and enhancements, keeping and maintaining what we own. 86% of our funding in 2018 is going to go towards those specific programs, with smaller majorities in new capital projects in land and asset acquisition, and just a small portion of it going to capital planning, comprising that $122 million that you see in 2018. Finally, we wanted to talk a little bit about the public art policy that's new to this year and is continually to be refined. The Community Culture Plan adopted in 2015 highlighted the desire to reinvent the public art program. Over the past year, staff has worked to create a policy that includes funding for and integration of public art with our capital improvements in the public spaces. We're now in its final stage, and the planning board will be seeing much more in the upcoming CIPs related to the components, which includes a % for art, criteria for eligibility, and the framework for implementation. We do have current projects such as the civic area and some transportation projects that integrate it, but this really takes a more holistic approach with how departments are integrating art into their capital improvement programs. And with that, I will turn it back over to Jean, who's going to go through the capital tax renewal process and the next steps.
So there was a little highlight section in the CIP about how the funding for the 2014 approved community culture safety tax is progressing. We see that every day, and you guys do too, the new bridge and all of the work going on in the civic area. But a lot of great projects already completed up at Ebenfine Park, some University Hill lighting, so much underway right now. So, and the, going to be really, I guess it's that way, the new underpass or the replaced underpass coming up. So a lot of value for the $29 million that voters approved in 2014. We had there was a little short memo attached to your materials around the capital improvement tax renewal process that we've been, has been underway for most of this year. We had a 12-member advisory committee that took the heavy lift of working with staff and some community-based nonprofits to go through and understand a full range of the city's unfunded needs and work to develop some guiding principles and a recommendation to the City Council for renewal of the community culture safety tax. With that, so their recommended package includes a really wide range, a diverse range of projects that are urgent unfunded needs in the city that will serve to fulfill a number of different goals and achieve a number of different outcomes. They worked very hard to think about what was that mix, how they aligned with the city master plans and the city goals, what communities they served, making sure that they're not too much additional operating. I mean, they considered a lot of different things. This was a great committee, and they worked very hard on this. And they also, we talked with a number of community-based projects. It was really trying to round out this package to have a wide range of community support for a renewal of the tax. There are a lot of different nonprofits that would benefit from this as well. The information that you received, and I know we got a comment Monday about, it wasn't really a staff recommendation on that because we didn't have a staff recommendation yet. We'll be talking to council next Tuesday about this, and our staff recommendation is to support renewal of the tax with the committee's recommended package. The staff recommendation and analysis and memo should be available tonight or tomorrow, should be online. So there's a lot more information on there. We provide a little more information on various projects with some urgency. So the council will be considering input from various advisory boards that have offered support for the renewal, and also some suggestions around potential package changes. So what we might be looking for from the planning board is something around support or your thoughts. This will feed into future, if it passes, will feed into future CIPs, and so you would be seeing we would all be seeing the benefits of these projects all around the community. So next steps, council will discuss the tax renewal. Will be to city council in August, and then potential October budget hearings for the rest of the CIP. And we have our staff recommendation around the CIP and the capital tax renewal for you. So you have questions.
Great. Thank you, Jean. Questions from the board? We'll put this out for a public hearing, although I'm not sure we have any public with us right now. Before we enter into any discussion about the elements, but do folks have questions?
I have a couple questions.
Go ahead, Liz.
I was wondering if the CU South flood mitigation studies, this is probably for Annie, who knows everything about.
I don't know everything, but I'll do my best.
So there's no SEEP for that.
That's right.
So is that because all the studies that would take place for that sort of overlap with whatever a SEEP would be, or?
So I think originally we thought that the flood mitigation plan that we completed in 2015 looked at, 15 different alternatives and came up with this regional detention facility. So we felt like, and looked at environmental impacts of each and costs, and essentially did a SEEP. I know that you've probably learned a lot about the flood mitigation project, and I know that we're 3/4 of the way through the 4-body review for the land use designation and the Boulder Valley Comp Plan approval. And I know there's a lot of commitments that we're making to, through that process. So I don't really know what the best way to wrap that up would be, if it's a SEEP or something else. I think that if we were to do a SEEP, we could certainly, and I think we plan on looking at different flood scenarios, whether it's a 500-year, what happened, a long duration, a short duration, high-intensity storm event, looking at a lot of different things that have been brought up through this process. I don't know if it makes sense to wrap that up in a SEEP. If we were to do a SEEP, the SEEP would go back to the Water Resources Advisory Board for approval. There's also the annexation process, and that would go to this board. We've moved the funding for the flood mitigation plan from 2018 to 2019. It's bond funded, so that'll come back to you next year in the CIP, that funding request. So it's not for next year, but the following year.
Okay.
So I don't know if, certainly our plan is to follow through on all these commitments that we've made through this process. I don't know how to package that, if a SEEP is the best way to do that, or if there are other processes. I know that there will be a lot of agreements made along the way between the city and CU. And, we plan to involve the community in all the information that we collect. We have a lot of information. We're just starting, we haven't even started the preliminary design because we're waiting for the final approval.
So with this, thank you. But with the SEEP, do you ever have like a citizen technical advisory board or anything like that? Or is it I know it's sort of, holistic, and it pulls in people from all the different departments and boards and everything, so maybe that's...
So typically, a SEEP is done before you start the design of a project, and it kind of informs what you're designing. We have had technical experts involved in our flood mitigation planning efforts. We did that on 4 Mile Canyon Creek and Wonderland Creek when we were, this was back many years ago when we were trying to, there's a spill flow that happens from 4 Mile to Wonderland Creek, and we were looking at whether we should maintain that flow in 4 Mile or let it spill to Wonderland, and, we involved some technical experts in that conversation, So we have done that through our flood mitigation plans.
Okay.
I don't know if it's ever been done as part of a SEEP.
I see.
So.
Great, thank you.
And Annie, I just want to say also thank you for responding to the citizen comment we got from Ms. Black about the 4 Mile project, which was
You're
really
welcome.
helpful.
Yeah, that was great.
Helpful.
Other questions for staff?
Can I ask?
Liz, go ahead.
Yeah, on the city emissions numbers for the city facilities and operations. I don't have that right in front of me, but anyway, that's excellent news on the city's emission reduction efforts. And I was wondering if in the charts, are the city numbers net with the solar that's been implemented, on some of the city facilities?
So Joe Castro, Public Works, Facilities and Fleet Manager. So those numbers reflect electrical usage. In the city facilities that have solar PV, we have about 2 megawatts of solar PV throughout our city facilities. And so when we measure greenhouse gas emissions, we measure the electrical use. And by having solar, the electrical use is decreased.
Okay.
And so in that way, it is counted. We can't count the actual renewable energy credits off those solar panels.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Great. Other questions? Crystal?
Joe, since you're here, and I know how many good things you've done, including those electric bikes for people rather than opting into a car. But have you thought about a different graphic presentation on our emissions reduction? Just because I thought it was a little bit confusing, and I thought it could be more dynamic. I don't know if you'd ever thought about that.
We haven't, because we like to show the trend, and if you see it is getting busy, because we show the baseline 2008, and then years 2010 to now, so it is starting to get busy, and we could look at a different graphic presentation. Certainly.
Yeah, and I've brought this up before, but Susan Osborne, when she was the mayor, that was one thing she thought should be right on our first page of our website, is our mission, showing the progress that we've made.
Yeah, no, and I want to clarify, this is just city operations in our capital projects. It's not citywide.
But then you had that section in that was kind of confusing about the CU and their diesel, and I think I got kind of lost on that.
That was because we had to correct the fuel numbers. We've been actually providing CU fuel because they lost their biodiesel fuel source. So they are now fueling at the city municipal service yard. And unfortunately, that was captured in our 2015 and 2016 numbers. And so we had to make a correction to the graph because it showed a significant rise that we couldn't quite figure out until we really looked at the numbers.
So Crystal, if it's helpful, we can just make that revision and clear what's changed and just send you guys a new one. But I will also say there was a link to our new city Boulder measures indicators website in that information. So I encourage everybody to take a look at that.
And it is also on the city's dashboard as well.
And then I have a question for Parks. And my question is with all the infill development that we approve, every meeting, how is Parks going to serve that? And I guess I'd like to say we also talk about the public realm, which would benefit people that live in those projects, but may not quite fall under a park definition. But how does the park department discuss that? And I read about all the good park stuff you're doing.
Yeah, so Jeff Haley, Planning Manager for Parks and Rec. There's kind of multiple ways that we approach providing parkland provision to the new residents or new neighbors in the community. Most importantly, right now, we have enough parkland scattered throughout the city to meet the levels of service that are required by industry standards. So for example, and as you've probably seen through the comp plan update, we're required to have a park within a half mile of every resident. And then we also have playgrounds within a quarter mile and different types of levels of service. Through needs assessment and GIS mapping, we're currently meeting that level of service pretty much throughout the community in different ways. And so right now, there's not a lot of new park land that's being acquired or developed in that way. We do have a couple of undeveloped park sites that are mentioned in our CIP, like Violet Park, up on Violet Avenue, and then Eaton Park, which is out in Gun Barrel. Those are yet to be developed, and we're working on those and actually programming those in the capital plan. And then the last thing I'll mention, we do review all the land use applications that come in through Planning and Development Services. Within the code, there are open space and park requirements within these developments. Typically during site review, they'll have a certain amount of acreage of park or open space provision, so it's areas set aside for playgrounds or small amenities for those little developments. So we carefully monitor those and work with the applicants and developers to provide nice amenities to those neighborhoods. But those are kind of the primary ways we're approaching that.
Yeah, so what about Boulder Junction? And how is the park development going there? Do you feel, as you're seeing the area develop, that we're getting enough kind of outdoor space for people within some of those bigger site reviews? And then the land that was set aside as public land, do you think we've hit that on a right number?
I believe so in terms of the original Transit Village area plan. And in fact, in the CIP document, we had last year funding to start the design process for what we call a pocket park at Boulder Junction. We're working on that this year. And then as you'll see in the CIP for 2018, an additional $350,000 that allows us to construct those improvements at that small park. So as part of that Boulder Junction development, as it continues to grow and develop, we do have that small park space that'll serve that immediate community with a public gathering area. It's basically where the pathway goes down to the Goose Creek. We've also looked at, similar to my last comment, what is the service area of that Boulder Junction and what are other parks nearby? So for example, if you go under 30th, you can be right at Mapleton ball fields, for example, just on the west side of 30th. There's a small play area there. We have plans to redevelop that park into a more community type park instead of just ball fields. And then similarly, if you go east, eventually you can get to Valmont City Park, which has also included our CIP. So a lot of times it's not about just having a park right next door, but what can we do, like the small park in Boulder Junction, but also close proximity connected by pathways and those kind of things. So yeah, we're working on that. As Boulder Junction continues to develop, we should have the park, that small park in the site there, completed by next year. So does that help?
Yeah, I think back in Whittier when we kept track of all the infill that was going on, and then we literally nagged city council. Luckily, Don Mock was moved to our neighborhood, he became a city council member. But before he did, we all got the city council to buy what was the old Bradford's lumber yard at Spruce between Spruce and Pearl off Folsom. I know some of you remember that. And it's great. It's got a basketball court, and people from the surrounding higher density projects use that fully. So it's kind of a little bit more than a few benches, but not quite as big as a neighborhood park.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's exactly how we really look at all these projects, even if there's a small green space, like the Washington School redevelopment. Over the past several years, we had a small green area that's now a public park space within that on North Broadway, moving up there. So, yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Other questions?
Yeah.
David?
I have a transportation-related question. With the underpass at 30th and Colorado, I was happy to see that in there. And I'm on the working group that's looking at the 30th and Colorado corridors, and I know that there's a lot of really interesting street design concepts being tossed around that will come out of that working group. I saw a reference to the working group, but where will I don't know exactly how that will dovetail with budgetary figures that will come out of recommendations that eventually turn into a real design for that corridor that will be implemented over the years.
Garrett Slater with the Transportation Division of Public Works. And so to answer your question, as you're well aware, through your involvement in the working group, so the study is overlaying and is out of the gate first, and the design is now underway following behind. And at some point, once we have a better understanding of the recommendations for the study as to what would happen at the node of 30th in Colorado, then we'll start working on the preliminary design of that. So you're probably asking, well, how did we define what the budget is for that project without having the study completed first? And we did that by developing a concept design for one possible design option that would work for the intersection. Okay. And that's what allowed us to submit for the federal grant to allow the funding to come through to the city for that project to be funded. And so the budget we're working with for the underpass at the intersection is largely based off the concept design that we'd put in place. That doesn't mean that we're necessarily locked into that fixed budget, but that's what we're programming for at this point in time.
That's good. Yeah. And this might be really detailed, but is the underpass at Foothills in Colorado, is that going to be at the same location as the existing bridge kind of area, or is that still kind of being looked at, how that's going to...
That's also being studied.
Studied, okay.
Right, so there will be a SEEP for the Foothills in Colorado underpass.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question. Will there be a SEEP for these different complete street corridor type of projects?
So the thought process for the corridor studies is that they're going through largely the same process as a SEEP would require, but to a much greater degree. There's a big, broad effort that's looking at a whole variety of disciplines and aspects and resources of these corridors. And so for Canyon, as well as Arapahoe and 30th in Colorado, for all these corridor studies, the efforts that have been undertaken are considering all the factors that a SEEP would require, and then a whole lot more beyond that. So the thought process is that a SEEP would be somewhat redundant and pale in comparison to the actual study effort itself.
And then I was reading about the 19th Street corridor. Is that, I can't remember if that was unfunded or you're starting planning on it?
So it is funded, and we are starting design on that. We expect to get or have a kickoff meeting for that design actually here in the next few weeks. And so in terms of what that entails, that's a construction project that is funded from Norwood to Sumac, and then we're going to look at options for the future between Sumac and Yarmouth, and there will be a SEEP on the 19th Street project as well.
And I bring that up because it's always been my pet peeve on Broadway. They eliminated across Broadway, especially from downtown north, a lot of the crossings that people would just have always taken to get across Broadway going east and west. And so the reason I ask about the SEEP is, do you bring that up in a SEEP? Because I think we do a good job on cars and bikes, and I know you're going to put in, you have a big sidewalk program, but less so for pedestrians. And I think it's really important, if people don't feel safe getting out of their cars and being able to cross streets and et cetera, they're not going to get out of their cars. They're going to take that easy jump in the car and not worry about the kids crossing the street. So is that an issue the SEEP would address?
Within the context of the 19th Street corridor, both the through, the to, and across will all be addressed for 19th Street. But to be sure, the reason we received the federal funds to actually implement improvements to 19th Street is because of the lack of pedestrian facilities in and around Crestview. And so that's the whole premise and purpose of that project. But as we undertake all our projects, we look at opportunities to incorporate complete street principles. And so certainly we'll be looking at the crossings along 19th Street. So we won't, it sounds like your question was also oriented towards Broadway as a part of the 19th Street effort.
Well, I was just kind of complaining about Broadway, but yeah.
That effort won't.
Not Broadway North, but I mean, Broadway from the downtown up to where was, I think, Iris or something.
So not affiliated with the 19th Street effort, I'll add that one of the items that it's in the transportation CIP budget and has been for many years is the missing links pedestrian budget, which incorporates missing links of sidewalk as well as crossing treatments across streets. And so that budget is going to be funding the implementation of a crossing at Broadway and Poplar, and we expect that will be implemented late this year. So that's one small effort towards one of the things you're describing.
That is. Any other critical questions before we go to the public who may not be here? I had just one for Jean, and it could be a broader question, which is, has staff given any discussion about how to weave in resilience concepts into the overall CIP planning process, and particularly identifying critical risks and stressors for the kind of capital and asset base that the city has, and kind of looking over, we talked last week, for example, about the potentially disruptive force of autonomous cars and what that may mean for our parking infrastructure, for example, or other sort of things. And I've also seen some other cities and transportation agencies start weaving that into either asset management plans or capital plans or that sort of thing. Has there been some discussion about how to weave the kind of city's resilience universe in with something like the CIP?
In fact, there has. But I think where we're starting is at the master planning level. So especially with a lot of these plans that are going to be going through updates in the next year or so, we're really trying to have a framework around resilience. So we're asking a lot of very specific questions around that, about our service delivery and planning with each of these departments or services from a resilience lens. So it'll start there. And I know that, there are a lot of our CIP projects that really are about resilience at their core. But, and I'm sure Joe and others can speak to, it's an important concept that is, by being adopted with the new comprehensive plan and all of the work going on with the resilience strategy, it's something that all of the departments are working on as we do each of these projects. So I think we'll be seeing it very specifically in the master plans and through our asset assessments, and you'll be seeing that showing up.
Great. Forward to that. Any other comments or questions? No comments yet. Seeing none, why don't we go to the public? Cindy, anyone signed up? Would anybody like to address the board on the CIP tonight? Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the board. We've got some framing questions here for us, and I think what I'll suggest is we quickly go through each of these questions and then look for a motion on the CIP overall. So let's start with the big enchilada question number one, which is just whether the CIP is consistent with the long-term big picture policies in the Boulder Valley comp plan. And I think staff.
Straw poll our way through that, I think, or?
Sure, well, I was going to do a negative poll to see if anybody thought there were anything about it that didn't address that, because I'll throw out my gratuitous thought that I thought it was really an excellent plan and the best I've seen since I've been on the board. So great work, everybody who kicked in on it.
And I wanted to make a comment on the art with the Boulder Valley Comp Plan, but maybe I should do it under number 5, capital improvement sales and use tax, because it seems like a lot of the art projects, art and culture, have settled in that tax.
It could also go under 2 in scope, depending on the nature of your comment. So if you want to just bring it up now.
Okay, I'll bring it up right now. I'm glad that we have put in policies about the arts in the Boulder Valley Comp Plan, and a lot of members of the community have really brought this up, and that's the reason we have actually some more vibrant statements. But I honestly think that this community is ready to take the big leap for the arts. And what the big leap looks like, to me, I call it a decade for the arts. I'd take I'd increase the capital improvement sales tax to cover a decade, and I'd include arts and culture. And when I say that, I mean I'd have like a third of the tax to go to arts and culture. And actually, there's a respectable number going to arts and culture. If you look at BMOCA and Studio Arts, they're getting quite a bit of money. But I just think the community is ready to fund the arts, and now is such a good time. And when I say fund it, I mean capital programs like we're doing. You know, BMOCA's the city facility, the dairy is, so, and I know how you've been involved in both of those, Joe, and I want to thank you as a member of this community for the good work that you've done on that. But I'd say capital facilities as well as programs, because we ask a lot of our nonprofit partners to serve diverse cultures and diverse ideas and perspective and people and various ages. But unless we have some programs, unless we have some funds that are going to fund the programs that these different groups put on, it's not going to happen. At least happen enough to really put us on the map, or catch up with our neighbors, I should say, in the arts, some of our neighbors. And then I'd also have a pot of money for the planning, because all of these projects, whether they're developing new programs or they're planning for facilities, take money to get them going, or to at least get them to the stage where they know what the whole project is going to look like. And I think about GOCO, Great Outdoors Colorado. They have money they have planning grants. Well, you know this, planning grants, capacity building grants, grants for programs, and then all the capital infrastructure as well. And then they have different goals that change every 5 years or so, depending on who's on the GOCO board. Some years it might be a preference for open space and agricultural preservation. Other years it might be sports facilities and more urban type of development. But I'd like to see something like that on that scale within our community. Of course, GOCO's statewide. But just think of the arts program. I think of E-Town all the time. They did a big capital program to raise money for that facility. And then there's a huge opportunity for them to expand their programming. But it takes money to do that. It takes money to figure it out, and it takes money to do it to serve a broader range of our community. So that's my spiel. I'll write to the council and the capital improvement tax renewal group and let them know this. But I'd love to have the planning board, your thoughts either in emails or tonight on how we might really kind of kickstart the arts and give them the respect that a community of our size, should be funding.
I'll just throw in, I know Denver's having a similar conversation right now, and one of the things that they're, I think, wrestling with is that affordable, both living and working space for artists are disappearing, and we have that problem to a much greater extent than Denver does. And if we don't address that, I'm not sure how much some of the other stuff will matter. And so I think if we're going to have that big picture conversation, we also need to follow up on both funding to help work on affordable spaces, and probably, looking at some of the things we talked about with our community benefit policy on, finding ways to incentivize affordable space for artists and that sort of thing as part of it. But it's a real resource requirement if it's going to make a real difference. So I agree with you, but I think that needs to be part of it.
I love that you've, brought that up, because that is part of it.
You guys worked hard on that policy.
And we got more to come, so, but thank you. Harmon?
Yeah, I want to pick up something that I left off with last year, and it's about the nexus between community resilience and local businesses and the capital improvements program. And, I think a big part of our resilience is having a diverse community. And we talked about this last year in terms of promoting local businesses that can actually perform some of the functions that are in the capital improvements program. And I had a motion last year that was approved by a unanimous vote of planning board that was around that last July 28th. And I think the motion language was that we recommend that council consider and direct staff to study the potential of creating guidelines for CIP expenditures that encourage procurement from disadvantaged business enterprises and local enterprises to promote social and economic equity and community resilience. This year, the CIP doesn't include any new language around that. And in the comp plan, we also added 2 new policies around local business development and supporting local businesses in the name of that type of resilience. So I see there being a pretty strong nexus between supporting our local contractors. I think if we want to have affordable housing, one way is to produce more affordable housing units, and another way is to get people who live in Boulder to make more money so that they can afford to live here. So there are a lot of intertwined positive impacts that we have if we support our local businesses. And in a plan that provides for $500 million worth of spending over 5 years, I think we could make a better effort. I understand that the city does not give special concessions to local and minority vendors on the award of its contracts, and I think I indelicately told Chris Meschuk last month that hurt me to know that was the policy of the city, and I think the city ought to look at that, and I plan on making that motion again.
I know that we passed along some of that information to the council last year with some additional analysis of what we may or may not be able to do, and I don't recall the ins and outs of that specifically at the moment, but I'd be happy to forward that information back on to you guys that we had provided last year.
Thanks for your efforts.
Sure.
Liz?
Yeah, well, you covered most of what I wanted to say about it, but our comp plan, this recently revised, which just won't reflect because we're just now approving it, but the resilience aspect of it. And I think it would be really interesting to see the CIP next year if it has sort of some indication in some of these budget allocations, that this is going to improve our resiliency in the face of climate change, this way or that way. I mean, it could even apply to, like you said, holistically apply to IT. You know, it could apply to rec centers. Are they, you know, equipped to be emergency shelters or whatever, things like that. I won't go any further because John covered it really well. But and then there was one other thing which I brought up, I think, every year, but and that's because I was on Landmarks Board, and we have a preservation plan, and I see land acquisition in here under utilities and under open space, and we don't have any budgeting for acquisition of historic properties, but when a property comes up for landmarking, if there's a board that's inclined to landmark it over the owner's objection, then we end up in this, you know, major citywide battle with all this strife and brain damage. And it just seems like if we somehow, and I don't know how this would work exactly, but it seems like working with the preservation staff would be the way to start, but to figure out if we could have a land acquisition budget for historic preservation. And I don't know if to have it in the CIP, if that means you would have to target particular structures ahead of time or how it would work, because it is a very reactive sort of situation where you don't know when something's going to go up for sale. You don't know what the proposal for demolition might be, things like that. But anyway, I feel like we're always in this really reactive mode when it comes to preservation, and maybe the CIP is a place where we could be a little bit more prepared. So that's all I have to say about because the comp plan does talk a lot about historic preservation.
So I had one kind of overarching comment that went in the number one, actually two. One was the resilience issue, which I think Liz just raised again, that I do think we need to have some more feedback into the CIP, and it may be that it'll take a little while to work its way up through the master plans. But if we're investing this much money in a capital program, we need to understand both the risks to that investment and then how it addresses the risks that we have that are out there. I think that's just sound decision-making and asset management sort of policy. My guess is it'll take a while to think about the best ways to do that. But I know folks are beginning to wrestle with that in other contexts. The other one...
And if you're seeing examples of how that's happening, we'd love to take them.
Okay, I'll look out for some of those and forward them your way.
Great.
And then the second one, wanted to pick on Jim Reeder for a minute because he's been quiet and behaving himself in the back of the room, and we can never let that occur. And that's to focus on some of the policy projects that have just gotten done, and I think how they reflect on the BVCP policies. And so I sent a couple pictures that I snapped not very well off of my cell phone on a project that we approved last year, which was the Mesa Trail flood recovery and the Bear Canyon trail recovery process. And I just wanted to flag a couple things about this that I think in this little project that's a fraction of the CIP that's important for the big picture of the CIP. I thought this was an exemplary project. This trail was closed for 5 or 6 months. We were all missing it. Wasn't really sure what to expect. And when I came back onto that trail, I was surprised and delighted at the design excellence, at the sustainability, at the resilience. And, that's the sort of thing that I think makes people happy. In this case, for the open space taxes. In other cases, it could be any of the sort of taxes or funds that fund these projects. And so just a reminder of, I think, how important it is to tie back to certainly the sustainability and resilience, which is the whole nature of this project. I mean, that crossing was blown out, and my cross-country skis will be vastly more sustainable now that that crossing is in place. But I really want to focus for a second on the design excellence area. We've been pushing our developers, private developers, pretty hard to pick up their game. But when the city itself does this, I think everybody is winning on that front. And I really want to commend Open Space for a just A-plus job on this project. And I know a lot of that is going in the other ways. You don't have to do a crossing in a beautiful masonry sort of approach, but you did. You don't have to do those stormwater recovery projects with masonry and local stone, but you did, and it made it a much better project. And the more we do that with our underpasses and other things, and I know we do it, and I'm picking on Jim, but I could easily pick on transportation or parks or anybody else, it really, I think, does improve it. So I just wanted to make that tie back to the comp plan and to the kind of general city principles on design excellence, and then also think about ways in the future to just make sure, we're capturing and celebrating some of those pieces. We talk about the public art element, and I think it is good, it is important, but the basic fundamental design is also something that I think makes people feel better about their investments in the long run. Harder to do with IT infrastructure, I know, but there are a lot of places where we can win on this. So,
Yeah, it's beautiful.
other thoughts on the first question that we have on the big picture? Good. So why don't we move to number 2? Thank you, Jim. The second question was on scope, priorities, schedule, and other sort of things in the CIP. Any comments, questions on that? I thought it pretty much nailed it. Crystal?
Oh, yeah, I agree. I did want to make a comment on the library. Well, first of all, I was really pleased to who's ever in charge of library scoping, I guess the arts, library and arts are. But I was pleased to see North Boulder, the library we've all talked about, in North Boulder kind of move up through this whole process, and then also mention of the Gun Barrel Library. But I did want to point out, we used to have a sales tax, I think maybe 2 of them that were dedicated to the library, and then when they were expiring, they were repurposed into the general fund. And when I was reading this packet, and saw some funding overview for the Boulder Public Library, one of the things was an increase in sales and use tax, and we had that. And when we repurposed that tax, as well as one of the open space ones that was going to transportation, another open space one in 2019, I can't even remember where that one went, but there have been a number of them that have been repurposed. And I just think for an accountability to the community, it'd be good to kind of follow up on that, because when they're always up for a vote to extend and repurpose them, we always say for firefighters and police and, all these good things that the community supports. But, and that's why it's kind of interesting when you see all of those same projects in this tax. So I'm just wondering how those monies were spent and where they went. And I know a lot of it's general fund because, over 10 years, 15 years, we've grown as an organization and trying to catch up on our backlog of maintenance. I know that we haven't always been great about that. But it just kind of jumped out at me as kind of ironical that we repurposed the library taxes now. Creating a new tax to adequately fund them was just interesting. And I totally support funding the library and the 2 new libraries, potential new libraries.
Any other comments on number 2?
I just have a question about when the scope is determined if on something like land acquisition for, say, open space or for the utilities, is the target of the acquisition already determined, or is it just sort of that money is just in there in case something comes up?
Well, I know the Open Space and Mountain Parks has an acquisition plan, and I know Jim can probably speak to that more specifically. And probably Annie and Douglas can talk about the utilities, but I think that's a little more opportunistic. They've identified areas that are key risks, and when those opportunities arise, we try to meet them.
And I'll save Jim a trip up. I can say for open space that the funds in there for acquisition of like water rights and mineral rights and land and that sort of thing, there is an acquisition plan, but it's also opportunistic based on when landowners have those things coming up. And sometimes the department will know because they're in negotiations with them, and sometimes they don't know, and those kind of oddball opportunities just pop up. So it's some of both, but you got to have gas in the tank in order to make it happen.
Right, okay, thank you.
I mean, they used to have a list of 200 people that they'd been in contact with over the years. So I'm sure that's dwindled somewhat, but you're totally right, John.
Thanks.
Jim, you want to shed some more light on this?
You know, while Jim's coming up, let's make a quick comment, which is I don't have any comments on scope or priorities this year, but I really, really appreciate seeing comments from previous years affecting what's gone in this plan. So the stuff I said a few years ago is in there, and I'm like, that's great. Thank you.
Jim.
Jim Reeder, Trails and Facilities Service Area Manager. Yeah, John, you're exactly right. And basically, we have a team of about 3 or 4 real estate agents that deal with looking for land that's available, and it really is opportunistic on the one hand. On the other hand, we know some properties where we'd really like to get a hold of if we could. We have worked with, they have worked with some owners for 20 years or more in order to get a piece of property. And in the end, we got it, and we're very happy to do that. So it's a little bit of both. We try to have enough money available to hit those big properties, expensive properties, and we've got a couple coming up so that we can buy them when they are available. But basically, it's both sides. Opportunistic when something comes available, and those that we've been looking for 20 years. So.
Thank you.
And we don't have a list of 200, I don't think, anymore, but we do have a list of probably, I would guess, 50.
Great, thank you, Jim. So why don't we move on to number 3, which is recommendations regarding policy issues raised by the proposed location and design of CIP projects. And I'll just start based on some conversations we've had on the South Boulder Creek flood control project that I think there was, we've had vigorous conversations over the last 6 months or so on some of the kind of unanswered questions about design, and as it moves into a more refined set of design, I think this is one that does require a lot of attention, and hopefully, given the kind of direction of conversations with CU, some creative thought while also keeping the pressure on to get that project done. So, other thoughts in this category? Seeing none, why don't we move on to number 4, which is recommendations on the CIP projects to undergo SEEP review process. And there was a recommendation in, attachment 3 or something like that on that front, a list. Any disagreements, thoughts that there were either too many or too few?
It's hard to weigh in on something like that.
As the process moves forward, we evaluate those. I know, Douglas, we're having a conversation next week about the sewer interceptor project on would it really benefit from a SEEP? Is it going to go through this other thing? And we really try to hone in on what would be the benefit of what process. And so I think as we go through the revisions to the handbook and the SEEP checklist, we'll be around that, is because we've got a lot of different projects with a lot of different things that would be most beneficial about process, and we want to make sure that they're worthwhile.
So reading body language, I'm getting a sense that we think you're in the ballpark on that one.
I'm
So-
still recovering from the Valmont Butte seep. Anybody was around for that?
I was there with you on that one. And then the last question that we had in front of us was recommendations on the capital improvement sales and use tax renewals. I think your comments went to that point, Crystal. Others, David?
Sure. Well, I just want to make sure that, you know, from where I sit, this is really important. The CCS has been a very important source of funding for all these wonderful things that we see pop up around town, around our city. And so I don't know if we are being asked for a special recommendation on that, or if our recommendation to approve the CIP in general will say that we'll include that, but it could warrant a special recommendation to put that on November, you know, up for renewal. So I just wanted to really make sure that we send a strong message on that if people are in agreement with that.
Other comments?
Could we see the list, the recommendation list or whatever? The committee recommended project list. I mean, those all seem reasonable to me, and I know there are several we've talked about quite a bit. The North Boulder Library, relocating the fire station. On the community projects, those are all, I support those. I am a little concerned about this is probably going to go over like a lead balloon, but I mean, if there's an organization that's not a city organization that's actually politically active, I think we should be careful and just be aware of whether we're in a position of supporting political action with people's tax dollars. I don't know if that's something we want to do or not. So otherwise, looks okay, good to me.
I agree
Any
with
other-
that, yeah. That kind of jumped out at me. But some of these are actually associated with development projects that we have approved. I'm assuming, and this could be totally wrong, that Community Cycles is funds for their new, whatever they
For
call
their new
it,
facility near Boulder Junction.
shop, yeah, at Spark, and Meals on Wheels would be at McKenzie Junction, as would Studio Arts Boulder.
Correct, it's for they're for capital projects.
They're
as well.
capital
They're not
projects that were-
programs, they're capital.
Yeah,
Same as
that
the
were a
city.
part of development, all three of those development reviews that we approved.
Growing Gardens and Holiday before that.
And the what? The-
Growing Gardens and Holiday neighborhood before that.
Oh,
years ago.
really? Okay. Is that what they're using that for, in Holiday?
Well, no,
This one's the
Years ago.
Oh, okay.
pollinator pavilion at the.
Where would that be?
I think it's at the Iris Gardens, Long's Gardens, yeah.
So I'll make one observation that I think all these are great projects, and I think the tax is a great idea. But if you're looking to November, there's a real north and central skew to these projects. And I think if you're looking for community-wide support, I don't see a whole lot in the south, and I don't see a lot in the east there. And it probably makes sense to look for things that other parts of the city will value on that front. And I think a lot of these are kind of citywide benefits, and that we'll appreciate. But I think people also, if they're going to increase their taxes, want to see something in their backyard as well. So I would look for some of those opportunities to help kind of smooth this out. I wouldn't necessarily kick anything. So I think these are good projects, but may need to rebalance a little bit.
The committee did look at that, and we did a whole mapping of all the projects under consideration. And the thing was is that there was timing, readiness, urgency, different types of things that there weren't projects in other parts of the community that really met that same level of urgency and readiness. But I think that's part of why the 2014 renewal was really pretty focused on the downtown core areas. This one we're seeing as in a few other geographic areas of the city, but keeping it to that 5-year renewal, that some of those next needs will be ready as we, in the next few years to be potentially considered for the next round.
And I guess my concern would just be, it's got to win on a citywide vote.
Right, exactly.
And the thought that maybe the other part of town will get things 5 years from now isn't necessarily going to cause them to
I agree.
fill in that piece. So it may just need to be proactive down there, or look for some of these community projects that, have some of the special benefits down there, or there could be public art that would, particularly fit in some of the parks or underpasses or other sort of things in that area, because I think the geographic equity will be on people's minds when they get there. Other thoughts?
I mean, sort of like the other side of that is, neighborhoods like North Boulder don't have projects that have been completed that we can look at and say, oh, this has benefited us in the past, like Baseline Underpass or stuff like that. So maybe the other side of that is, unless people drill into the details of these projects, they're not going to know what's in that tax. They may look backwards and say, well, nothing's happened in my neighborhood for a long, long time, so why would I vote for that?
Yeah, I think it's a tough issue putting together these kind of packages. I think that are project-based, and, in the same way Fast Tracks had that issue, and now we didn't see that part in our part of town. I think people are sensitive to those issues now.
Really good point, I think.
Yeah.
So with that, I think we are at the stage for any final motions or recommendations. Anyone willing to hazard one?
Is there motion language for us somewhere?
I think there was a slide.
All right, I'll make the motion.
Excellent.
I move that Planning Board recommend to the City Council approval of the 2018-2023 proposed capital improvement program, including the list of CIP projects to undergo a community and environmental assessment process as outlined in the staff memorandum. Should I make them both together?
Why don't you go for
Okay.
it in a second?
I also move that Planning Board recommend to the City Council renewal of the 0.3% sales and use tax to fund a variety of capital improvement projects.
Anyone second?
I'll second it. And I also wanted to, after we vote on this, have a second set of, or at least one motion in addition to this that I'll make around the additional language about resilience in the same manner that we did last year.
Sure, but we can at least approve this one based on the main motion.
Yep.
Is
That's
there?
what I said.
I don't know where this would fit in. Maybe it's just an additional motion like Carmen was going to do, but I was going to say Planning Board further recommends that the city analyzes the source of revenue to fund an expanded vision for arts and culture in the community.
Why don't we make that as one of the separate category of motions that we can touch? Any other discussion on the main motion made by Member Payton? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor of Liz Payton's motion, please say aye and raise your hand.
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes unanimously. Are there other motions that members would like to make? Harmon?
So, Cindy, I'll send you this by email, so don't worry. My motion is Planning Board, well, I'll just read it the way I wrote it. For consistency with amended comp plan policies regarding environmental purchasing and sustainable business practices that call for purchasing of local products and services, as well as policies promoting diversity and resilience, Planning Board further recommends that Council develop guidelines for CIP expenditures that encourage procurement from disadvantaged business enterprises and local businesses to promote social and economic equity and community resilience.
I'll second that.
Any further discussion on that motion made by Mr. Zuckerman and seconded by Mr.
We
Bowen.
want to cite the Boulder Valley Comp Plan, the new section we put in on local businesses, support for local,
I could put those policies in there, but
I don't know.
I'm okay. I know
Yeah.
what numbers they are. It's 412 and 511, but so it's all right. It's okay. Okay.
Any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question on that motion. All in favor of Harmon's motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes unanimously. Crystal, I think you may have had a motion.
Yeah, I just, and I'll take any suggestions if you could make it better, but Planning Board recommends that the city analyzes the source of revenue to fund an expanded vision for arts and culture in the community.
I'll second that.
Okay, and let me just read you the mission of our arts and culture mission.
Actually, before they do that, we do have a motion from Gray, seconded by Peyton.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, and the mission of the Boulder Office of Arts and Culture is to facilitate an alignment in the creative community around our shared vision for culture. Together, we will craft Boulder's social, physical, and cultural environment to include creativity as an essential ingredient for the well-being, prosperity, and joy of everyone in the community. So I think that that's fine. So this would just help identify a source or analyze a source of funding. Maybe they'll say we have enough funds. Maybe people will say, yeah, we really could do a lot more.
So Crystal, would you consider historic preservation part of culture? I mean, I would.
I mean, I do under culture.
Yeah, okay.
And I would consider like some of the Chautauqua projects under culture and I love it that you brought up workspace and who knows what people could come up creatively to help this mission if we had like $5 million a year rather than a couple.
And
every 10 year, every 8 years, whatever the tax goes.
I'll just note in response to your question that if you look at the Pottery Lab, if you look at other cities, often the space that you find for affordable artist space or residents are historic structures. And, they often, if you look down in Denver, a lot of those spaces are old industrial places with a lot of original buildings and that sort of thing. So I think there could be a nexus that would make a lot of sense there.
Great.
It won't work for everything, but it might work for many.
Right.
So, other, David?
And this includes public art.
Oh, yeah.
So that's, yeah, I just wanted to make sure. Yep.
Arts and culture.
Yep.
So I'll call the question on Crystal's motion. All in favor of that, please say aye and raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? That also passes unanimously.
I'll send it to you.
Any other motions or thoughts?
Just a thought.
Okay.
Just a thought.
Just, the city of Boulder has about 100,000 people, spending about $100 million per year on capital improvements. And
It's a lot higher this year than what.
And yeah, and it fluctuates, but where I'm averaging over the 5-year period. And I think that's pretty awesome that I'm getting $1,000 worth of capital improvements per person just for living here. And beyond that, it's being done really well. It's being managed well, efficiently, and it looks great. So thank you.
Thank you, guys.
3 really quick things. So to lead off on that, a big thank you to all the staff and all the folks that aren't here as well that contribute to this work. It's a lot. And everybody does a really great job, and they're really awesome to work with. So
We're very lucky.
we are. David, I want to apologize for calling you Peter.
Oh, I thought of saying something, but they only have our last names up here, so it's like.
I know your name, and I'm sorry.
No problem at all.
And I also just wanted to say, I think that this is a point of pride for you guys and for all of us at the city. As David, you know, I was invited to do a presentation at the National Planning Conference this year on capital improvement planning. I was asked to provide the example of how it's done well. And we had a pretty healthy number of folks at the session, and a lot of folks had asked questions and looked at our stuff afterwards, and I've been sending examples of our prioritization document that we put together for this year's CIP. So there were a lot of folks that are struggling with this in different ways. There are a bunch of folks that were like, your planning board looks at this, and wanted to know kind of how we did that and how that worked. So that was kind of cool to see that other communities are looking at our stuff and looking at us as an example. So.
Well, and I'll just add to that to say, not only is it impressive that it's at a high level of quality, but it's an improving level of, it's getting better every year while still being excellent, and that's really impressive. So thank you.
I was going to add, actually, sorry.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
When I first got on planning board, there was a lot of conversation about how to integrate art and design into these public works projects, and that conversation is pretty much not happening now because it's working out really, really well. So they're great. They're great projects.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I was really impressed with the footprint that Boulder had at that conference. It's a huge conference with people from all over the world. And also how few cities actually send planning board members to these conferences. I didn't really run across that many. Boulder really, I think it takes advantage of that and then really contributes a lot to the public thinking on these things. So that was great.
Great. So with that, I think we can close out agenda item 5B. Thank you all for your patience and hard work.
Thank you.
And excellent work. And I think we're at matters. And do we have any from staff?
I don't have anything.
I'm glad that we're going to go out with my favorite culvert on the open space now.
Yeah, how neat. It's
That's your
beautiful.
picture, right?
Any other matters from the board? I think seeing none, we are adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you.
We can submit pictures in advance.
If you could all turn off your microphones, that would be great.